Picture this. You're 27, successful, independent, and your family thinks you're their personal, unpaid nanny. A week before Christmas, I accidentally overheard the most shocking conversation that changed everything. My mother and sister Maria were in my living room planning my Christmas for me. "Camila will watch all 9 kids," my mother said with that cold laugh I knew too well. "She's single, has nothing better to do, and honestly, she owes us." But here's what they didn't know. I was recording every single word. What happened next? On Christmas morning, while 25 family members showed up expecting a feast I was supposed to cook, and 9 screaming children needed a babysitter I was supposed to be, I was 8,000 miles away in the Maldives, sipping a $40 cocktail in an overwater villa. My phone buzzed relentlessly. 110 missed calls from Mom, desperate voicemails from Maria, angry texts from relatives asking where I was. But that's not even the craziest part. When I dug deeper into why my family felt so entitled to my time and money, I discovered they'd been stealing from me for years. We're talking about $50,000 my grandmother's house, and a financial scam that went back to my childhood. By the end of this story, I didn't just escape their Christmas trap. I exposed their lies to the entire community and started a revolution that helped hundreds of other women break free from family manipulation. Trust me, you need to hear how I turned from their doormat into their worst nightmare, and why my revenge was so satisfying that it went viral and changed lives across the country. This is the story of how I bought my freedom with the most expensive Christmas gift I ever gave myself. My name is Camila Rodriguez, and at 27, I thought I had finally built the life I'd always dreamed of. As a data scientist for a tech startup in downtown Chicago, I earned a 6-figure salary that afforded me a beautiful 1-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Every morning, I'd wake up in my perfectly organized space, brew coffee in my spotless kitchen, and head to work knowing that every aspect of my life was carefully planned and completely under my control. Or so I believed. December 18th started like any other Tuesday. I'd spent the morning analyzing user engagement patterns for our latest app update, the kind of methodical work that satisfied the part of me that craved order and logic. My apartment reflected this same precision. Books arranged by genre bills filed chronologically, and a budgeting spreadsheet that I updated religiously every Sunday night. I'd worked hard for this independence, climbing from an entry-level analyst position to my current role in just 4 years, all while building a healthy savings account and establishing the kind of credit score that made loan officers smile. This was my sanctuary, my proof that I could create stability in a world where my childhood had been anything but stable. Around 3 o'clock, I realized I'd left some crucial client presentations on my kitchen counter documents I needed for the next morning's meeting with potential investors. The December wind cut through my wool coat as I hurried back to my apartment building, keys already in hand, as I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. I was mentally rehearsing my presentation when I heard voices coming from inside my apartment, familiar voices that made my stomach tighten with a familiar dread. I slipped my key into the lock as quietly as possible, not wanting to announce my arrival. The voices grew clearer as I stepped into my entryway, and I immediately recognized my mother's sharp tone mixed with Aunt Linda's more measured cadence. They were sitting on my cream-colored sofa, the one I'd saved for 6 months, to buy, treating my living room like their personal meeting space. I'd given my mother a spare key for emergencies, but apparently her definition of emergency was quite different from mine. I froze in the hallway, still hidden from their view, when I heard my name mentioned. Something in my mother's tone made me press myself against the wall and listen instead of announcing my presence. "Camila will watch all 9 kids for Christmas," my mother was saying with that matter-of-fact authority I remembered from childhood. "It's perfect, really. She's single, has nothing better to do with her holiday, and honestly, Linda, she owes us after everything we've sacrificed for her over the years." My blood turned cold. 9 kids. Maria's 4 children, Rachel's 3, and Aunt Linda's 2 grandsons. Ages ranging from 3 to 14, all high energy, all demanding, all expecting to be entertained and fed and supervised for an entire day while the adults enjoyed their Christmas celebration. Aunt Linda's voice carried a note of concern. "But shouldn't we ask her first? I mean, it's a big responsibility, and she might have made other plans." My mother's laugh was sharp and dismissive, the same laugh I'd heard throughout my childhood whenever anyone suggested I might have preferences or boundaries. Plans. What plans could she possibly have? She doesn't have a boyfriend, doesn't have children of her own, and frankly, after all the money we spent raising her and putting her through college, the least she can do is help out the family. Besides, she's good with kids, and she makes enough money now that she can afford to contribute to the food and entertainment. The casual cruelty in her voice hit me like a physical blow. They weren't asking for help. They were assigning me a role in their Christmas celebration without my consent, assuming my compliance, dismissing my autonomy as if I were still a teenager living under their roof. But I was a grown woman with my own life, my own apartment, my own carefully constructed independence, and they were planning to steamroll over all of it. I fumbled for my phone, partly to steady my shaking hands, and partly to check the time when a notification caught my eye. A bank alert from my savings account. My carefully monitored, meticulously balanced savings account was showing a withdrawal of $500 that I definitely hadn't made. The timestamp showed it had occurred just 2 hours ago while I was in my afternoon meeting. My heart began pounding as I stared at the alert. I had my debit card in my wallet. My online banking required 2-factor authentication, and I never ever made impulse purchases. The only people who had any connection to my financial accounts were my parents from years ago when they'd helped me set up my first checking account as a teenager. But surely they wouldn't still have access, would they? As I stood there in my own hallway listening to my mother and aunt plan my Christmas without my consent, while looking at evidence of unauthorized access to my bank account, a terrible realization began to form. This wasn't just about babysitting. This wasn't just about family expectations or guilt trips or the usual emotional manipulation I'd grown up navigating. They thought I'd be their unpaid servant again, but as I stared at that unauthorized bank alert, I realized this went deeper than babysitting. As I stood there staring at that bank alert, my mind began racing through a pattern I'd been too naive or too conditioned to recognize before. The unauthorized withdrawal wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the latest in what I now realized was a systematic exploitation that had been going on for years. I thought back to how this all started, how I'd gradually become the family's go-to solution for every inconvenience, every last-minute crisis, every situation where someone needed free labor. It began 2 years ago, shortly after I'd gotten my promotion and moved into this apartment. Maria had called on a Friday evening, her voice tight with what sounded like genuine panic. "Camila, I need your help desperately. There's been a family emergency and I need someone to watch the kids tomorrow, just for a few hours while I handle this crisis." Being the responsible sister I thought I was, I'd immediately canceled my weekend plans, a hiking trip with college friends I'd been looking forward to for weeks, and showed up at her house at 7 in the morning, ready to help with whatever catastrophe required her attention. The kids were already dressed and fed, which seemed odd for an emergency, but I didn't question it. Maria rushed out with a quick hug and a promise to be back by noon. At 2 o'clock, when she still hadn't returned and wasn't answering her phone, I started to worry. At 4 o'clock, when I finally reached her, I could hear laughter and music in the background. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Camilla. This is taking longer than expected. The girls surprised me with a spa day, and you know how rare it is for me to get time for self-care. You don't mind watching them a little longer, do you?" That should have been my first clue, but I was still operating under the assumption that family helped family, that sometimes emergencies extended longer than planned, that being flexible was part of being a good sister. The spa day became a full day and evening of pampering, then dinner with friends, then drinks afterward. I finally got home at midnight, exhausted and frustrated, but telling myself that Maria deserved a break and that I was doing the right thing. The next weekend it happened again. This time, the emergency was a work crisis that turned out to be a shopping trip to the outlet malls with her sister-in-law. The weekend after that, it was a medical appointment that somehow required 8 hours and involved Maria posting photos on social media of herself at a wine tasting. Every single weekend for months, there was a different emergency, a different crisis, a different urgent situation that somehow always involved Maria doing something fun and relaxing while I provided free childcare. When I finally worked up the courage to address the pattern to suggest that maybe she could find other childcare arrangements, or at least give me more notice, the response was swift and brutal. "You don't understand family responsibility," my mother told me during one of our increasingly tense phone conversations. "Maria is trying to hold her marriage together and raise 4 children. She needs support from her family, not criticism from her selfish sister." My father chimed in with his favorite refrain, "You're single with no life anyway. What else are you going to do with your weekends? At least this way, you're contributing something meaningful to the family, instead of just focusing on yourself all the time." The phrase, "no life anyway," cut deeper each time I heard it, as if my career accomplishments, my friendships, my personal interests, my carefully cultivated independence meant nothing because I didn't have a husband and children. As if being single automatically made me available for unpaid labor, as if my time had no value because I wasn't using it to serve a nuclear family of my own. But it was last Christmas that really showed me how completely they'd dismissed my personhood in favor of my utility. I'd arrived at my parents' house on Christmas morning, expecting to participate in the family celebration, maybe help with some cooking exchange gifts and enjoy the holiday like everyone else. Instead, I walked into complete chaos. The kitchen was a disaster zone with no meal preparation started, 9 children were running wild with no adult supervision, and every member of my family was already drinking mimosas and acting like the logistics of Christmas dinner would magically handle themselves. "Oh, good, Camilla's here," my mother announced to the room. "Now we can actually start enjoying Christmas." She handed me an apron and a list of tasks that would have challenged a professional catering staff, then disappeared into the living room to continue her celebration. I spent the entire day cooking a meal for 15 adults while simultaneously managing children who were sugared up on Christmas candy and completely overstimulated by the holiday chaos. While I was sweating over multiple burners and trying to prevent the 3-year-old from electrocuting himself with Christmas lights, my family was playing board games, napping off their alcohol consumption, and taking leisurely walks around the neighborhood to work up an appetite. Nobody offered to help with the cooking. Nobody stepped in to assist with the children. Nobody seemed to notice that I was single-handedly managing an event that should have required multiple adults working together. When dinner was finally served, perfectly timed and beautifully presented despite my solo effort, I got a polite, "Thanks, Camilla," before the conversation moved on to other topics. I ate quickly and quietly, then spent another 2 hours cleaning up the kitchen while everyone else watched movies and digested their meal. I drove home that night feeling hollow and exhausted, questioning whether this was what family was supposed to feel like. Last week, while organizing my financial records for tax preparation, I decided to review my bank statements from the past year, looking for charitable deductions and business expenses. That's when I found something that made my blood run cold. Buried in my monthly statements were regular transfers to Maria's account. $200 here, $150 there, always labeled as family support in my online banking system. Transfers I had no memory of authorizing occurring with suspicious regularity every few weeks. This wasn't just about free babysitting. They had been systematically stealing years of my life and my money. The discovery of those unauthorized transfers should have prepared me for what came next. But nothing could have cushioned the blow of my mother's phone call 3 days later. Her voice carried that particular tone of assumed authority that I'd learned to dread, the one that meant she'd already made decisions about my life without consulting me, and was now informing me of my obligations rather than making requests. "Camilla, we need to finalize the Christmas arrangements," she began, without preamble, as if we'd been in ongoing negotiations, rather than her having made unilateral plans. "I've been thinking about the catering situation, and honestly, it makes the most sense for you to handle the food costs. You make good money now, and unlike the rest of us, you don't have your own family expenses to worry about. We're looking at about $2,000 for a proper spread for 25 people, plus you'll need to pick up individual gifts for all 9 children. Nothing too extravagant, but something meaningful from their Aunt Camilla. The casual way she delivered this financial bombshell took my breath away. $2,000 for catering plus gifts for 9 children delivered, as if it were a foregone conclusion rather than a massive expense that would consume nearly a month of my discretionary income. But it was the reasoning that truly stung. The dismissive assumption that because I didn't have a husband and children, my money was somehow less important, less needed, more available for family appropriation. "Mom, that's a huge expense," I managed to say, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. I wasn't planning to spend that much on Christmas, and I definitely wasn't consulted about catering for the entire family. Her sigh was theatrical and familiar, the same sound she'd made throughout my childhood whenever I failed to meet her expectations of selfless compliance. "Camila, I'm disappointed in your attitude. After everything we've invested in you, after all the sacrifices your father and I made to give you the education that led to this successful career, the least you can do is give back to the family that made it all possible." That phrase, "give back to the family," had become a weapon she wielded with increasing frequency over the past few years. Every request for money, every demand for my time, every expectation that I subordinate my needs to family convenience was justified by this nebulous debt I supposedly owed for the crime of being born and raised. "We spent over $100,000 on your college education," she continued, warming to her theme. "Private school tutoring, SAT prep courses, 4 years of tuition room and board study abroad programs. Your father worked overtime for years to afford the opportunities we gave you. We never took vacations, never bought new cars, never indulged ourselves because we were investing in your future. And now that you're successful, you want to hoard all that success for yourself, instead of sharing it with the people who made it possible." The guilt was expertly applied, each word calculated to make me feel selfish and ungrateful for having boundaries around my finances. But even as the familiar shame washed over me, a different emotion was building underneath. Suspicion. Something about my financial situation wasn't adding up, and her aggressive push for me to cover expensive family obligations felt less like normal family expectations and more like desperation. That evening, I logged into my savings account with growing apprehension. What I found there made me physically nauseous. My carefully maintained savings account, which should have contained nearly $15,000 according to my meticulous records, showed a balance of just over $7,000. $8,000 was simply gone, vanished from an account that I monitored religiously and never accessed impulsively. I clicked through transaction histories with shaking hands, looking for explanations for charges I'd forgotten about, for any reasonable cause for such a massive discrepancy. Instead, I found something far worse. My savings account had been linked to my parents' checking account for something called Family Emergency Access. The connection had been established 3 years ago, apparently, when I'd first opened the high-yield savings account and needed my parents to co-sign some of the paperwork due to banking regulations about transferring funds from my old accounts. The transaction history showed a pattern of transfers that made my stomach clench with recognition. Money moving from my savings to their checking account in amounts ranging from $300 to $800, always timed around family gatherings, holiday celebrations, or what I now realized were Maria's emergency babysitting weekends. The transfers were labeled with generic descriptions like family support and emergency assistance, but the timing told a different story entirely. I scrolled back through months of statements matching dates of transfers to my memories of family events. The large withdrawal in October corresponded exactly with Maria's elaborate birthday party that I'd been told was just a simple family dinner. The September transfer aligned perfectly with my parents' anniversary celebration that had somehow expanded into a weekend getaway for 8 couples. The August withdrawal happened the same week as the family reunion that I'd spent 2 days helping organize while everyone else enjoyed the festivities. Every celebration, every gathering, every family event that required significant expense had been funded partially by my savings account without my knowledge or consent. They weren't just taking my time and labor, they were literally stealing my money to pay for the privilege of exploiting me further. The pattern was so systematic, so calculated, that I couldn't dismiss it as a series of misunderstandings or emergency borrowings. This was deliberate financial manipulation, designed to ensure that I remained both the family's source of free labor and their unwitting funding mechanism. They were using my money to pay for events where I provided the childcare, the cooking, the cleanup, and the coordination while they enjoyed themselves as guests at parties. I was unknowingly financing. I wasn't just funding their party, I was financing my own emotional imprisonment. The revelation about my systematically drained savings account left me reeling for days, but it also sharpened my awareness in a way that years of subtle manipulation never had. I found myself analyzing every family interaction through this new lens of suspicion, looking for patterns and strategies I'd been too trusting to notice before. So when my mother called on Saturday morning asking me to pick up groceries for Sunday dinner because she was running behind on preparations, I agreed with a different kind of attention than I'd ever brought to these requests before. I spent nearly $200 at the organic market on the specific items she'd requested: grass-fed beef, imported cheeses, expensive wine, artisanal bread. The kind of luxury groceries that I now realized had become standard for family gatherings funded by my unknowing contributions. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was purchasing ingredients for a meal I'd probably end up cooking while everyone else relaxed using money from accounts they'd been secretly accessing for years. I arrived at my childhood home around 11 in the morning, earlier than expected, because the market had been less crowded than anticipated. My mother's car was in the driveway along with Maria's SUV, which struck me as odd since family dinner wasn't supposed to start until 2 o'clock. I let myself in through the front door with my key arms loaded with grocery bags, calling out a greeting as I made my way toward the kitchen. That's when I heard my mother's voice, sharp and animated, coming from the kitchen in what was clearly an intense phone conversation. The tone was different from her usual social chat. More focused, more strategic, with an edge of excitement that made me pause in the hallway. Something instinctive made me set the grocery bags down quietly and move closer to listen, my newfound suspicion overriding years of conditioning about respecting privacy. The kitchen wall in my parents' house had always been thin, a quirk of the 1960s construction that had made it impossible to keep secrets during my teenage years. Now that architectural flaw worked in my favor as my mother's voice came through clearly, along with Maria's responses on speakerphone. "The timing has to be perfect," my mother was saying, her voice carrying the kind of calculated planning I associated with her most successful manipulations. "We get all the kids there at once, make sure she's already committed to watching them before we spring the additional requests. Once we trap her with all the kids on Christmas, she'll cave completely. She always does when children are involved." My blood turned cold as I realized they were discussing me, discussing Christmas, discussing strategy as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a family member to be consulted. I fumbled for my phone with trembling hands, my finger finding the voice recording app just as Maria's laughter came through the speaker. "Exactly," Maria agreed, her voice bright with malicious satisfaction. "She's gotten a little resistant lately, asking questions about money and time commitments, but she still can't say no when kids are crying for Aunt Camila. We just have to make sure she's in too deep to back out before she realizes how much we're asking of her." I pressed record and held my phone toward the wall, my heart hammering so hard I worried it might be audible through the device. This was evidence, concrete proof of the calculated nature of their exploitation, and some part of me knew I needed documentation of what I was hearing. "After this Christmas, she'll never say no to us again." Maria continued, her words becoming clearer as she apparently moved closer to her phone. "We'll have broken down her last boundaries completely. Think about it. If she can handle 9 kids for an entire day while cooking for 25 people and managing all the logistics, she'll know she can handle anything we ask of her. It's psychological conditioning at its finest." My mother's laugh was genuinely delighted, as if Maria had just shared the cleverest strategy rather than outlined a plan to psychologically break her own daughter. "And the best part is, she'll feel guilty for even thinking about complaining afterward. How can she say we're asking too much when she's already proven she can do it? We're setting the new baseline for her family contributions." The casual cruelty in their voices was breathtaking. They weren't just planning to use me. They were planning to break me, to destroy whatever remained of my ability to establish boundaries or protect my own interests. This wasn't family asking for help. This was predators strategizing about their prey. "The financial piece is crucial too," my mother added, and I leaned closer to the wall despite my revulsion. "She's been asking more questions about money lately, getting suspicious about the account transfers. But once she's invested this much in Christmas, the catering, the gifts, all her time and energy, she'll be too committed to pull back. It's the sunk cost fallacy working in our favor." Maria's agreement was immediate and enthusiastic. "Exactly. And we make sure she knows how much everyone is counting on her, how disappointed the kids would be, how it would ruin Christmas for the whole family. She's too guilt-driven to let that happen, even if she's starting to see through some of our strategies." I was so absorbed in recording their conversation, so horrified by the calculated nature of their planning, that I didn't hear footsteps in the hallway behind me. It was Rachel's voice, sharp with surprise, that made me jump and nearly drop my phone. "Camila, what are you doing lurking in the hallway?" I spun around, my heart racing as I tried to look casual while simultaneously stopping the recording and shoving my phone into my pocket. Rachel was standing just a few feet away, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion as she took in my position pressed against the kitchen wall. "Oh, hi, Rachel." I managed, forcing what I hoped was a natural smile. "I was just looking for the bathroom. I thought it was this way, but I got turned around. You know how it is when you really need to go." It was a weak excuse made worse by the fact that I'd grown up in this house and knew perfectly well where every bathroom was located. But Rachel seemed to buy it, or at least decided not to push further, nodding toward the hallway behind her. "Guest bathroom is back that way," she said, still watching me with curious eyes. "Mom's in the kitchen on a call, so you might want to wait to say hello." I nodded enthusiastically, perhaps too enthusiastically, and headed in the direction she'd indicated, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd just heard and recorded. I didn't actually need the bathroom, but I locked myself inside anyway, pulling out my phone with shaking hands to stop the recording and save the file. They weren't just using me. They were systematically destroying my ability to say no, and I had recorded every word. Walking out of that bathroom with the recorded evidence of their manipulation strategy felt like stepping into a completely different version of myself. The naive, people-pleasing Camila who had walked into this house an hour earlier was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the game being played and was ready to play it better than they ever could. If they wanted to treat me like a chess piece to be maneuvered around their board, then I would become the piece they never saw coming. When I emerged from the hallway, my mother was off the phone and unpacking the groceries I'd brought, her face lighting up with that particular smile she reserved for moments when I was being useful. "Oh, Camila, you're such a lifesaver, and you got the good olive oil, I see. Perfect. Now about Christmas dinner. I was thinking we could make it really special this year since you're handling the catering costs." The word handling was doing a lot of work in that sentence, transforming a unilateral financial demand into something that sounded like my generous offer. But instead of the resistance I'd felt building over recent weeks, I found myself nodding enthusiastically, my smile as bright and compliant as any she'd ever seen from me. "Of course, Mom, I'm so excited to contribute to making this Christmas memorable for everyone. $2,000 for catering sounds perfect, and I've already started thinking about gifts for all the kids. I want this to be the best Christmas our family has ever had." The relief that washed over her face was almost comical in its transparency. She'd been braced for pushback, for questions, for the increasing resistance I'd been showing lately, and my sudden return to eager compliance clearly delighted her. Over the next hour, as Maria joined us in the kitchen and they began outlining increasingly elaborate expectations for my Christmas contributions, I maintained that same enthusiastic agreement to everything they suggested. "What about entertainment for the kids?" Maria wondered aloud. "Something to keep them busy while we adults actually get to relax and enjoy ourselves for once." "I'd love to organize some activities." I responded immediately. "Maybe I could set up different stations around the house. craft projects, games, maybe even hire a face painter. Whatever it takes to make sure everyone has a wonderful time. The look that passed between my mother and Maria was pure triumph, the satisfaction of predators who believed their trap was working perfectly. They had no idea that with every additional demand they piled on every assumption they made about my compliance, I was mentally cataloging their strategies and building an understanding of just how systematic their exploitation had become. That evening, I started what would become my most important project of the year, a detailed documentation journal. Using a simple composition notebook I picked up at the drugstore, I began recording every interaction, every request, every manipulation tactic with the precision I normally reserved for data analysis at work. I wrote down exact quotes noting the date, time, and context of each conversation, tracking the progression of financial demands and the specific language they used to justify their expectations. December 19th, 3:47 p.m. Mother called to discuss additional touches for Christmas dinner. Suggested I provide wine pairings for each course, estimated additional cost, $300 to $400. Used phrase, since you're already investing so much, might as well make it truly elegant. Maria laughed in background said, Camila always goes above and beyond for family. The pattern became clearer with each entry. They had a sophisticated system of emotional manipulation that they deployed with the precision of a military campaign. The guilt about family sacrifice, the emphasis on my single status as evidence that I had extra resources, the way they framed their demands as opportunities for me to demonstrate love and loyalty. It was all carefully orchestrated psychological warfare designed to make resistance feel like betrayal. 3 days later, my mother asked if I could help her organize her home office, claiming she was overwhelmed by holiday correspondence and needed someone with my organizational skills to help sort through paperwork. I agreed immediately, sensing an opportunity to gather more information about the scope of their financial manipulation. Her office was a chaos of papers, bills, and printed emails scattered across every surface. As I worked through stacks of documents, creating filing systems and bringing order to the mess, I came across a folder labeled Family Coordination that made my blood run cold. Inside were printed emails spanning 3 years' conversations between my mother and Maria that read like a masterclass in psychological manipulation and financial exploitation. The earliest emails dated back to my promotion announcement when I'd excitedly shared news of my salary increase with the family. Now we can really start maximizing Camila's contributions, my mother had written to Maria. She's always been the most financially responsible of all you kids, and now she has the income to match. We just need to be strategic about how we approach requests so she doesn't get suspicious or resentful. Maria's responses were even more calculated. I've been thinking about the guilt angle. She's always felt bad about not having kids, like she's not contributing to the family legacy. We can use that. Position childcare requests as her chance to be meaningfully involved in the kids' lives, not just free babysitting. Email after email revealed the depth of their planning. They discussed optimal timing for financial requests, emotional leverage points they could exploit, and warning signs that I might be growing resistant to their strategies. They had analyzed my personality like I was a problem to be solved, identifying my desire to be helpful, my guilt about being single, and my respect for family obligations as weaknesses they could weaponize against me. But it was the financial details that truly staggered me. They had tracked my contributions over the years with spreadsheet precision, noting not just the direct transfers from my accounts, but also the estimated value of my childcare services, meal preparation, event coordination, and gift purchases. According to their calculations, I had provided over $30,000 in combined financial and service contributions to family events over the past 3 years alone. The scope was breathtaking. My money had funded Maria's house down payment when her credit couldn't qualify her for the mortgage she wanted. It had paid for my parents' European vacation, the one they'd posted about extensively on social media, while claiming they'd saved for years to afford it. It had covered the bulk of Rachel's elaborate wedding reception costs, subsidizing the dream wedding she'd bragged about to everyone who would listen. Every major family milestone, every celebration, every seemingly generous gesture they'd made had been funded by systematic theft from my accounts and exploitation of my labor. They had built their family success story on the foundation of my financial stability and emotional compliance, then gaslit me into believing I wasn't doing enough, wasn't contributing sufficiently to the family that had supposedly sacrificed so much for me. They thought they had trained me like a circus animal, but I was secretly building a case against them. The evidence I'd found in my mother's office transformed my understanding of the situation so completely that I felt like I was operating from an entirely new playbook. For days, I carried that knowledge around like a secret weapon, waiting for the right moment to begin my counterattack. The opportunity came sooner than I expected when I realized that their entire Christmas strategy hinged on assumptions about my compliance that I was no longer willing to honor. If they wanted to play psychological games, then I would give them a masterclass in strategic deception. On Thursday morning, I called Elegant Affairs, the high-end catering company my mother had specifically recommended for the Christmas feast. I'd done my research and knew they were booked months in advance for holiday events, which had made their apparent availability for our last-minute order suspicious from the start. Now I understood why they'd been so accommodating. My mother had probably been planning this financial ambush for months, setting up the catering arrangement as one more way to ensure I couldn't back out of funding their celebration. Hello, this is Camila Rodriguez calling about the December 25th catering order for the Martinez family, I said, when the coordinator answered, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I need to cancel that order completely. The woman's surprise was evident in her pause. Cancel. But, Ms. Rodriguez, that's a $2,000 order for 25 people. Are you sure you want to cancel just 10 days before Christmas? Our cancellation policy requires full payment if you cancel less than 2 weeks in advance. I had anticipated this obstacle and was prepared with a response that would protect me financially while still achieving my goal. Actually, I'm not canceling because I changed my mind. I'm canceling because I found a better option that can accommodate some special dietary restrictions that came up. I understand about the cancellation fee, but I'd rather pay it than serve food that might make family members sick. As I spoke, I heard the distinctive sound of a key turning in my apartment door. My stomach dropped as I realized someone was entering my apartment unannounced, and there was only one person other than me who had a key. Maria's voice called out cheerfully from the entryway. Camila! Are you home? I brought coffee and thought we could finalize some Christmas details. Panic flooded my system as I realized I was about to be caught in the middle of sabotaging their carefully laid plans. The catering coordinator was still speaking, confirming cancellation details and asking about payment for the fee, while Maria's footsteps were getting closer to my living room where I was standing with the phone pressed to my ear. That sounds perfect, I said into the phone, my mind racing to find a way out of this catastrophe. Yes, I'll definitely want to upgrade to the premium package with the wine pairings. The authentic Italian family-style presentation is exactly what we're looking for. Maria appeared in my doorway just as I was speaking, her face lighting up with curiosity and what looked like approval. She mouthed, "Who are you talking to?" while settling onto my couch with 2 coffee cups, clearly planning to stay and listen to my conversation. Wonderful. I continued making eye contact with Maria while silently thanking every acting class I'd ever taken. And you're absolutely certain you can accommodate 25 people with the full traditional Italian Christmas menu? The lasagna, the ossobuco, the tiramisu, everything we discussed. The catering coordinator, clearly confused by this sudden shift in our conversation, started to respond, but I cut her off smoothly. Perfect. I'll call you back this afternoon to finalize the payment details and timing. Thank you so much for being flexible with our special requests. I hung up quickly before the coordinator could ask any clarifying questions that would expose my improvisation, and turned to Maria with what I hoped was a convincing smile of excitement. Was that about Christmas dinner? Maria asked, her eyes bright with interest. It sounded like you were making it even more elaborate than we discussed. Italian food sounds amazing. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I forced enthusiasm into my voice as I launched into the lie that would either save me or destroy me completely. "Oh, Maria, I'm so excited I found this incredible boutique catering company that specializes in authentic Italian family-style dining. They're more expensive than the original caterer, but the menu sounds absolutely divine. Think traditional Italian Christmas feast. Multiple courses, everything made from scratch, presented family style so we can all share and enjoy together." Maria's delight was genuine and immediate. "That sounds incredible. Mom is going to be so impressed. She's always talking about how much she misses authentic Italian food like her grandmother used to make. How did you find them?" I had seconds to come up with a believable backstory drawing on every detail I could remember about high-end catering from my corporate events at work. "A colleague at work recommended them. Apparently, they usually only do very exclusive private events, but they had a cancellation for Christmas Day and were willing to take on our dinner. The chef trained in Italy and specializes in traditional holiday menus that have been in his family for generations." The more details I added, the more convinced Maria became, and the more terrified I grew about maintaining this elaborate deception. But there was something intoxicating about watching her excitement build, based entirely on my fabrication about having this level of control over information that would ultimately determine the success or failure of their manipulation strategy. "What's the name of the company?" Maria asked, pulling out her phone. "I want to look them up online and maybe show Mom their website." This was the moment I'd been dreading, but my mind supplied an answer that surprised me with its creativity. "Nonna's Kitchen," I said without hesitation. "But they're very exclusive. They don't really advertise online. Most of their business comes from word-of-mouth referrals among people who can afford their premium services." Over the next hour, I elaborated on my fictional catering company with details that impressed even me. The chef who had learned family recipes from his Italian grandmother, the seasonal ingredients sourced from specialty importers, the traditional cooking methods that took days of preparation. Maria hung on every word, occasionally calling our mother to share updates about the amazing upgrade I was providing for Christmas dinner. That evening, I took the final step in cementing my deception. Using my graphic design skills from college, I created a simple but elegant business card for Nonna's Kitchen, authentic Italian family dining, complete with a fake phone number that went to a Google Voice account I'd set up specifically for this purpose. The next day, when I stopped by my mother's house to drop off some early Christmas gifts, I discreetly slipped the business card into her kitchen junk drawer, positioning it so it would look like something that had been there for weeks. They expected a feast to celebrate their manipulation victory. Instead, I was preparing to serve them complete chaos. The success of my catering deception gave me a dangerous confidence, a sense that I could outmaneuver their manipulation if I just stayed one step ahead of their planning. But maintaining the lie required me to be prepared for questions, to have documentation that would support my story if anyone became suspicious. That's what led me back to my mother's house 2 days later, ostensibly to help her continue organizing her office, but really to plant evidence of my fictional catering company among her papers. I thought I'd create a file for all the Christmas planning documents. I told her as we worked through the remaining stacks of paperwork in her home office. Contracts, contact information, payment schedules, that way everything is organized and easily accessible if any questions come up. She beamed at this suggestion, clearly pleased by what she saw as my increased investment in making their Christmas celebration perfect. "That's so thoughtful, Camila. I knew that promotion of yours would bring out even more of your organizational talents. There's a filing cabinet in the corner that has plenty of space. Use whatever drawer makes sense to you." The filing cabinet was an old metal unit from the 1980s, its drawers stuffed with decades of family documents in no particular order. As I worked through the files looking for the right place to insert some fake correspondence from Nonna's Kitchen, I tried to make sense of the financial paperwork that seemed to dominate every drawer. Tax returns, bank statements, insurance policies, and investment documents were mixed together with medical records and utility bills in a chaos that would have made my data scientist brain scream if I hadn't been focused on my immediate mission. It was in the bottom drawer, wedged between my father's life insurance policy and a folder of old medical bills, that I found a manila envelope marked Rodriguez Property, 2847 Maple Street. The address made my heart skip because I knew it by heart. It was my grandmother's house, the small but perfect craftsman bungalow, where I'd spent every summer of my childhood and countless weekends through my teenage years. The house that had been left specifically to me in her will, the house I'd been planning to move into once I'd saved enough for the renovation it needed. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of official documents. The first page was a mortgage application dated 3 years ago with my parents listed as the primary borrowers. But that was impossible. My grandmother had owned that house outright for decades, and she'd left it to me free and clear when she died 4 years ago. There should be no mortgage, no debt, no reason for my parents to be involved in any financial arrangements related to the property. As I flipped through the documents, the devastating truth began to emerge in cold legal language that felt like physical blows to my chest. Reverse mortgage, equity extraction, cash-out refinancing. Technical terms that all meant the same horrifying thing my parents had borrowed against the house that was legally mine, using the property as collateral for loans that totaled nearly $150,000. The paperwork showed a systematic liquidation of my inheritance over 3 years, with multiple loans and refinancing arrangements that had extracted every dollar of equity from the home my grandmother had worked her entire life to pay off. The most recent document was dated just 6 months ago. A final refinancing that had maxed out the available equity and left the property mortgaged to its full appraised value. But the loans were just the beginning of the betrayal. Attached to the mortgage documents were bank statements showing where the money had gone, and seeing the distribution of my stolen inheritance made me physically nauseous. $40,000 had gone directly to Maria for what was listed as a family business investment, but which I knew had funded the down payment on her dream house in the suburbs. $25,000 had paid for my parents' European vacation, the 6-week trip they'd taken last summer, while telling everyone they'd been saving for it for years. Another $30,000 had covered Rachel's wedding expenses, subsidizing the elaborate celebration she'd posted about endlessly on social media. The remaining funds had been used for debt consolidation, paying off credit cards and personal loans that my parents had apparently been carrying for years. Every major family milestone over the past 3 years had been funded by the systematic liquidation of my grandmother's final gift to me. They had stolen my inheritance piece by piece, using my beloved grandmother's house as their personal bank account, while I continued living in my expensive apartment, carefully budgeting and saving for the renovations I'd been planning to make the old house livable again. The emotional devastation hit me even harder than the financial betrayal. That house wasn't just an asset or an investment property. It was the place where my grandmother had taught me to bake her famous Christmas cookies, where we'd spent countless afternoons in her garden learning about plants and patience, where she'd shared stories about our family history that no one else bothered to remember. Every room held memories of the woman who had been the only adult in my childhood who consistently made me feel valued and loved unconditionally. I thought about all the times over the past 3 years when I'd driven past the house, noting the peeling paint and overgrown yard, making mental lists of the improvements I'd tackle once I moved in. I'd been planning my future in that house, envisioning holiday dinners in the dining room, where my grandmother had hosted our family for decades, imagining children of my own playing in the backyard where I'd spent so many happy hours. That house represented continuity, connection to my family's history, and the security that my grandmother had specifically wanted me to have. She had left me that house because she understood something my parents had never grasped: that I needed a foundation, a place that was truly mine, security that couldn't be taken away or manipulated by family members who saw my resources as extensions of their own. Her will had been specific and intentional, leaving the house to me alone rather than dividing it among all her grandchildren, because she'd watched my parents' financial instability throughout my childhood and wanted me to have something they couldn't touch. But they had touched it. They had taken it. They had converted my grandmother's love and foresight into funding for their own desires, and Maria's lifestyle upgrades, liquidating my future security to pay for pleasures they couldn't afford on their own. The house that should have been my sanctuary had become their ATM, and I had been completely unaware that my inheritance was disappearing dollar by dollar while I dutifully provided free labor and additional financial contributions to the very people who were stealing from me. I found myself walking through the house to my grandmother's old bedroom, where her antique rocking chair still sat by the window overlooking the garden she'd loved. I sank into that familiar chair, the one where she'd held me during thunderstorms, and read me stories on countless afternoons, and felt the full weight of generational betrayal settling over me like a suffocating blanket. They hadn't just stolen my present financial stability, they had robbed my past memories and mortgaged my future dreams. Sitting in my grandmother's rocking chair, surrounded by the devastating evidence of my family's financial betrayal, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The grief and shock were still there, but underneath them was a growing flame of pure determination. They had stolen my inheritance, my security, and my future, but they hadn't broken me. If anything, discovering the full scope of their manipulation had crystallized something I'd been afraid to acknowledge. I was done being their victim, and I was ready to take back control of my life in the most dramatic way possible. That evening, Jessica called with an invitation that under normal circumstances would have been exactly what I needed. "Camila, I know Christmas is always stressful with your family, so I thought I'd throw you a lifeline. A group of us from college are doing a ski trip to Colorado over Christmas week. Nothing fancy, just a cabin in Vail, some slopes, some wine, some much-needed decompression from family drama. You should totally come. It would be so good for you to get away from all that guilt-tripping and manipulation." 6 months ago, even 6 weeks ago, I would have jumped at this offer. A safe, affordable getaway with friends who actually cared about my well-being. An escape from family obligations that wouldn't create additional drama or financial strain. But as I listened to Jessica describe their modest plans, all I could think about was the $150,000 my family had stolen from me, the luxury vacations they'd funded with my inheritance, the extravagant lifestyle they'd built on the foundation of my grandmother's house. "That sounds wonderful, Jessica, but I actually have other plans," I heard myself saying, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was contemplating. "I'm thinking of doing something a little more extravagant this year." After I hung up, I sat staring at my laptop screen for nearly an hour before I finally opened the browser and began searching. Not for reasonable vacation options, not for budget-friendly escapes, but for the kind of luxury experience that my stolen money should have provided me with years ago. I was done being practical, done being responsible, done making sensible choices while my family lived lavishly off my sacrifices. The Maldives had always been my dream destination. The kind of paradise that I'd looked at in travel magazines while telling myself it was too expensive, too indulgent, something for other people who hadn't grown up with constant lectures about financial responsibility. But as I scrolled through images of overwater villas and pristine beaches, I realized that I had been financially responsible. I had saved, diligently budgeted carefully, and built a solid financial foundation. It was my family who had been irresponsible with my money. The resort I chose was unapologetically expensive, the kind of place that charged more per night than most people spent on vacation entirely. An overwater villa with a private deck butler service and every luxury amenity imaginable. I selected the upgrade package that included spa treatments, private dining, and sunset champagne service, adding expense after expense until the total cost made my hands shake. $8,000 for 5 days in paradise, funded by money from an investment account I'd opened 3 years ago, specifically because I'd felt uncomfortable with how easily my family seemed to access my other finances. This secret account had been my insurance policy, a financial safety net that I'd contributed to automatically each month and never mentioned to anyone in my family. The account that was supposed to fund my grandmother's house renovations, my future security, the life I'd been planning to build. Now it would fund the most defiant act of self-preservation I'd ever committed. But booking the trip was just the beginning of the complications I was creating for myself. My boss's email arrived on Tuesday morning with the kind of urgency that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. "All hands meeting December 24th. Mandatory attendance for key project leads." Major client presentation that will determine Q1 resource allocation and promotion decisions. Cannot be rescheduled due to clients' availability constraints. The timing was devastating and perfect at the same time. Missing this presentation could derail my career trajectory for years, but attending would mean abandoning my escape plan and returning to the family dynamic that was slowly destroying my sense of self. I stared at the email for 20 minutes, calculating the professional costs of rebellion before I realized that staying would cost me something far more valuable than a promotion. It would cost me my soul. The cover story I crafted for my family was elaborate and carefully constructed, built on the foundation of their own assumptions about my predictable compliance. I would tell them about a last-minute work obligation, a client emergency that required my immediate attention over the holiday. They were so accustomed to my work taking precedence over family events when it suited their needs that they wouldn't question my sudden unavailability. For my boss and colleagues, I developed an equally detailed deception about a family medical emergency that required my presence out of state. I researched the specific language used in family medical leave policies, prepared documentation that would support my story, and crafted emails that struck the right balance of professional regret and personal urgency. The complexity of maintaining these parallel deceptions was both terrifying and exhilarating. I was lying to everyone in my life, simultaneously weaving a web of stories that would either free me completely or destroy every relationship I'd carefully maintained for years. But as I finalized the details of my escape plan, transferring money, booking flights, and preparing the elaborate explanations that would cover my disappearance, I felt more alive and purposeful than I had in years. I wasn't just planning a vacation. I was orchestrating the most expensive act of rebellion in my family's history. Having my escape plan locked in place gave me a strange kind of clarity that made every interaction with my family feel like I was watching a play where I knew the ending, but the other actors had no idea their performance was about to be interrupted. The confidence that came from holding this secret, from knowing that I had booked my freedom while they continued to plan my exploitation, made it almost entertaining to observe how completely they took my compliance for granted. 3 days before Christmas, I arrived at my mother's house for what she'd described as a final coordination meeting, ostensibly to ensure all the holiday logistics were perfectly aligned. What I walked into was essentially a military-style briefing about my Christmas Day responsibilities, with my family members discussing my schedule, my duties, and my availability as if I were a hired employee rather than a daughter and sister who had supposedly chosen to help. I positioned myself in the hallway outside the living room, the same spot where I'd originally overheard their manipulation strategy, and listened as they dissected every hour of Christmas Day with exhausting precision. Maria had created a detailed timeline that accounted for every 15-minute block from 7 in the morning until 11 at night, with my involvement mapped out in color-coded segments that showed when I'd be supervising children preparing food, serving meals, cleaning up, or organizing activities. 7 to 8 a.m. Camilla handles breakfast prep while we sleep in. Maria was reading from what sounded like a printed schedule. 8 to 9 she gets the kids dressed and ready while we have coffee. 9 to 11 she supervises outdoor playtime while we finish gift wrapping. 11 to 1 she manages lunch and nap coordination for the little ones while we have adult conversation time. The schedule continued in this vein for the entire day, with me assigned to every unpleasant, labor-intensive task, while the rest of the family enjoyed what amounted to a luxury vacation, funded by my money and serviced by my unpaid labor. They had even planned bathroom breaks for the children around my availability, as if my entire existence revolved around their convenience. "What about room assignments?" my father asked, and I heard papers shuffling as they consulted what was apparently another detailed document. "We need to make sure the kids have adequate supervision overnight, in case any of them have nightmares or need help in the bathroom. Camila's taking the fold-out couch in the basement family room," my mother replied matter-of-factly. "That way she's easily accessible if any of the children need her during the night, and she won't disturb anyone else if she has to get up early to start breakfast preparations." The The casual way they'd assigned me to sleep on an uncomfortable couch in the basement, positioned to be available for childcare duties even while I was supposedly resting, crystallized just how thoroughly they'd reduced me to the role of live-in help. I wouldn't even get a proper bed in the house where I'd grown up, because my comfort was less important than my accessibility for their needs. My phone buzzed with a text, and I heard Maria's phone ring simultaneously. "Oh, that's Aunt Linda calling back," she announced, and I heard her answer on speakerphone. "Hey, Linda, we're just going over the final Christmas details with everyone here." Aunt Linda's voice came through clearly, tinged with what sounded like mild anxiety. "I've been feeling a little guilty about how much we're asking of Camilla this year. Are we sure she's okay with handling all 9 kids plus the cooking and cleanup? That's a lot for one person, even someone as capable as she is." Maria's laugh in response was sharp and dismissive, carrying a cruelty that made my stomach clench with recognition. "Oh, Linda, don't worry about Camilla backing out. Seriously, she's got nowhere else to go, and nobody else who wants her around for Christmas. She needs us more than we need her, and she knows it. Besides, what else is she going to do? Spend Christmas alone in her apartment feeling sorry for herself?" The casual brutality of that assessment hit me like a physical blow. The assumption that I had no other options, no other relationships, no value beyond my utility to their family gathering was breathtaking in its dismissiveness. But what made it worse was the laughter I heard from other family members in the background, as if Maria's cruel evaluation of my social isolation was amusing rather than heartbreaking. "I suppose you're right," Aunt Linda conceded, though she still sounded uncertain. "It's just that she seemed a little different lately, maybe a bit more, I don't know, distant, like she might be getting tired of always being the one who handles everything." This observation prompted Rachel to speak up, and I could hear the slight concern in her voice as she addressed what was apparently a worry that had occurred to others as well. "I've noticed that too, actually. She's been asking more questions about money and time commitments, and she seemed less enthusiastic about some of the requests than usual. Should we be worried that she might try to set boundaries or something?" My mother's response was immediate and supremely confident, delivered with the authority of someone who believed she understood me better than I understood myself. "Rachel, you're overthinking this. Camila has been our reliable help for years. She doesn't know how to disappoint family even when she's feeling a little overwhelmed. It's not in her nature to let people down, especially not during the holidays. She might complain a little or ask a few questions, but when push comes to shove, she'll do exactly what she always does." The certainty in her voice was absolute, built on years of successful manipulation and conditioning that had trained me to prioritize family needs over my own well-being. She had studied my patterns so thoroughly that she could predict my responses with mathematical precision, or so she believed. "Besides," my father added with what sounded like affectionate condescension, "Camila's always been desperate to belong somewhere, to feel needed and important. This is her chance to be the hero of Christmas, the person everyone depends on. She might grumble about the work, but deep down, she loves being indispensable." The conversation continued with increasingly personal assessments of my character, my motivations, and my psychological needs. As if I were a case study they were analyzing rather than a family member whose feelings and autonomy mattered. They discussed my predictable patterns, my need for approval, and my fear of conflict, with the casual expertise of people who had spent years exploiting these traits for their own benefit. What struck me most was how completely they had convinced themselves that they understood me, that they had decoded my personality so thoroughly that I had become predictable to the point of being controllable. They spoke about me with the confidence of puppet masters who believed they knew exactly which strings to pull to get the desired response, never considering that their puppet might have developed awareness of the manipulation. Their absolute certainty of my compliance was about to become the foundation of their complete downfall. Listening to my family dissect my personality and predict my behavior with such confident precision only strengthened my resolve to prove just how wrong they were about knowing me at all. But their absolute certainty also meant they would be monitoring my behavior more closely as Christmas approached, looking for any signs of the compliance they expected or the resistance they dismissed as impossible. This made the final preparations for my escape exponentially more dangerous, requiring a level of stealth and deception that made every moment feel like I was walking a tightrope over an abyss of discovery. The suitcase I'd chosen for my Maldives trip was a sleek silver hardshell case that I'd bought years ago for a work conference, but never used for personal travel. It was large enough to hold 5 days' worth of luxury resort wear, but small enough to hide under my bed pushed far back against the wall and concealed by the long bedskirt I'd strategically selected for exactly this purpose. Every evening after work, I would add another carefully chosen item to the hidden case: silk sundresses that cost more than I'd normally spend on an entire vacation wardrobe. A designer bikini that had sat in my closet with tags still attached for 2 years, sandals and cover-ups and evening wear, suitable for the kind of paradise I'd only dreamed of experiencing. The packing process became a ritual of rebellion, each folded garment a declaration of independence from the dowdy practical clothes I wore to family gatherings, where I'd inevitably end up covered in food stains and children's fingerprints. I packed flowing resort dresses in jewel tones that would photograph beautifully against tropical waters, elegant evening wear for sunset dinners. I planned to enjoy alone and casual luxury pieces that screamed expensive relaxation rather than unpaid family labor. But the suitcase's hiding place became increasingly precarious as my family's surprise visits to my apartment intensified in the days leading up to Christmas. My mother had always been prone to dropping by unannounced, using her spare key as if it were an invitation rather than an emergency access tool. But now she was arriving with increased frequency to discuss last-minute details, coordinate timing, or simply check that I was maintaining the appropriate level of Christmas excitement. Tuesday evening, I had just finished adding a silk-wrapped dress to my hidden suitcase when I heard the familiar sound of a key in my front door. I barely had time to shove the case back under the bed and arrange the bedskirt before my mother's voice called out from the living room. Wednesday brought Rachel with a plate of cookies and questions about my Christmas outfit. Thursday, my father stopped by to drop off folding chairs I was supposed to bring to accommodate the extended family seating arrangement. Each unexpected visit sent adrenaline coursing through my system as I mentally cataloged everything in my apartment that might betray my true plans. The Maldives resort confirmation emails I'd printed and left on my kitchen counter. The tropical sunscreen I'd bought and forgotten on my bathroom vanity. The travel-sized toiletries I'd been gradually accumulating and storing in my bedroom dresser. Every surface in my apartment had become a potential landmine of evidence that could expose my deception. Friday afternoon brought the closest call yet when Maria arrived without warning for what she called a final coordination visit, to ensure we were completely aligned on Christmas Day logistics. I was in my bedroom when I heard her key in the door, and I had approximately 30 seconds to scan my space for anything that might reveal my plans before she made it down the hallway to find me. The boarding pass was sitting on my coffee table next to my laptop where I'd left it after checking in online for my Saturday morning flight. My passport was beside it, open to the photo page because I'd been updating my travel insurance information. Both documents were in plain sight, undeniably suspicious, and absolutely incriminating if Maria noticed them. I grabbed both items and shoved them into a kitchen drawer, just as Maria's voice called out, "Camila, where are you? I brought wine and thought we could go over the final timeline together." "Just finishing up some work," I called back, forcing cheerfulness into my voice while my heart hammered against my ribs. "Come on in. I'll be right there." When I emerged from the kitchen, Maria was settling onto my couch with 2 glasses of wine and a thick folder of what appeared to be Christmas Day planning documents. Her eyes immediately went to the kitchen drawer I'd just used, and I realized with horror that I hadn't closed it completely. The corner of my passport was visible dark blue leather peeking out from the partially open drawer. "What's all the paperwork?" she asked casually, nodding toward the drawer while taking a sip of wine. "It looks official. Not more family coordination stuff, I hope. You're already doing more than enough for Christmas." My mind raced through possible explanations as I walked toward the kitchen, using the excuse of getting myself a glass of water to casually push the drawer completely closed. "Oh, that's just work stuff," I said with what I hoped was convincing dismissiveness. "International client contracts that need to be reviewed before the new year. You know how corporate legal documents are. They look much more important than they actually are." Maria seemed to accept this explanation, launching into her prepared presentation about Christmas Day timing and logistics, but I spent the entire hour-long visit in a state of barely controlled panic. Every time she glanced toward the kitchen, every pause in conversation, every moment when her attention seemed to drift from her planning documents made me certain that she'd noticed something suspicious and was waiting for the right moment to confront me. After she left, I realized I couldn't continue storing evidence of my escape plan in common areas of my apartment. The boarding pass and passport went into my underwear drawer, the resort confirmations were filed between old tax returns, and I began a systematic sweep of my space to eliminate any trace of tropical vacation planning. The process felt like erasing evidence of a crime I hadn't yet committed, but was absolutely determined to carry out. My final evening in the apartment passed in a strange alternation between excited anticipation and paralyzing terror. I would spend 10 minutes visualizing myself on the overwater deck of my villa, watching sunset colors reflect off pristine water while sipping expensive champagne, only to be jolted back to reality by imagining my family's reaction when they discovered my absence. The fantasy of complete freedom warred with the knowledge of the devastation my disappearance would cause, creating an emotional whiplash that left me exhausted and exhilarated simultaneously. I practiced my emergency explanations in the mirror, rehearsing the work crisis story I would tell my family, and the family emergency narrative I would give my boss, fine-tuning the details until they felt believable, even to me. I double-checked my flight information, confirmed my resort transfer, and set multiple alarms to ensure I wouldn't oversleep and miss the opportunity that had consumed weeks of planning. One careless moment would destroy my perfect escape, but I was already too committed to the rebellion to consider retreat. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December clarity that felt like a sign from the universe that my escape plan was meant to succeed. I had slept fitfully, waking every hour to check my phone and ensure I hadn't missed any alarms, but when dawn finally broke, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the day I would either liberate myself from decades of family manipulation or destroy every relationship I'd ever known, and surprisingly, the magnitude of that choice no longer terrified me the way it had during my weeks of planning. My flight to the Maldives departed at 11:30, which meant I needed to be at O'Hare by 9:30 for international check-in procedures. I had crafted the perfect cover story for my early morning departure, a grocery run, to pick up last-minute items for Christmas dinner that I'd forgotten during my regular shopping trip. It was exactly the kind of responsible, family-focused errand that would explain my absence without raising suspicion, and it gave me a legitimate reason to leave my apartment with a small overnight bag that I claimed contained reusable shopping bags and coolers for transporting perishable items. The ride to the airport felt surreal, watching the familiar Chicago skyline disappear behind me as my Uber driver navigated the Saturday morning traffic. I kept expecting my phone to ring with a family crisis or last-minute demand that would force me to abort my escape, but the device remained silent as we merged onto the highway that would take me to my gateway to freedom. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to truly believe that I was going to pull off the most audacious act of rebellion in my family's history. Check-in at the airport proceeded with the efficient smoothness I'd hoped for, my passport and boarding pass processed without incident, my luggage accepted and tagged for its journey to paradise. I made it through security with time to spare, found my gate and settled into a seat facing the windows where I could watch planes taking off for destinations around the world. The normalcy of it all felt almost anticlimactic after weeks of high-stakes planning and constant fear of discovery. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Dad had massive heart attack. In ambulance now, come home immediately. This is not a drill. He's asking for you. Maria. The message was followed immediately by another from my mother. Camila, where are you? We're at Northwestern Memorial ER. Dad collapsed at breakfast. Doctors don't know if he'll make it. Need you here now. My hands began shaking so violently that I could barely hold my phone steady enough to read the messages properly. A heart attack. My father, who despite all his manipulative behavior was still my father, was potentially dying while I sat in an airport terminal, preparing to abandon my family for a luxury vacation. The guilt hit me like a physical blow so intense that I actually felt nauseous as I imagined him lying in a hospital bed asking for me while I sipped champagne on a tropical beach. Every instinct I'd developed over 27 years of family conditioning screamed at me to run to the nearest ticket counter, cancel my trip, and race to the hospital to be the dutiful daughter they expected me to be. This was exactly the kind of crisis where my family needed me most, where my absence would be not just selfish, but genuinely cruel. How could I possibly justify choosing a vacation over my father's potential deathbed? But something about the timing felt suspicious, too perfectly calculated to derail my escape at the exact moment when I was most vulnerable to emotional manipulation. In all my years of planning family obligations around medical emergencies, work crises, and various family dramas, I'd noticed that these urgent situations had a tendency to occur precisely when I was developing independence or setting boundaries. With trembling fingers, I dialed the main number for Northwestern Memorial Hospital, my heart pounding as I asked to be connected to the emergency department. The nurse who answered was professionally calm as I explained that I was calling about my father, who had supposedly been brought in by ambulance after a heart attack. "I'm sorry, but I don't see any patient by that name admitted for cardiac events this morning," she said after checking her system. "We do have a patient with that name who was treated for anxiety-related symptoms and discharged about an hour ago. Is it possible there was some confusion about the nature of his visit?" The relief and rage that flooded through me simultaneously were almost overwhelming. He wasn't dying. He wasn't even seriously ill. He'd had what sounded like a panic attack, probably related to the financial stress I now knew was crushing my parents, and my family had deliberately exaggerated the situation to create a medical emergency that would force me to abandon my plans and return to their control. I sat in that airport terminal for another 20 minutes, staring at my boarding pass while text messages and missed calls accumulated on my phone. Each message was more frantic than the last, painting increasingly dire pictures of my father's condition and my mother's emotional breakdown, describing family members gathering at the hospital to support each other through this terrible crisis that apparently required my immediate presence. The manipulation was so textbook, so perfectly executed, that I almost had to admire their strategic thinking. They had identified the one scenario that would be guaranteed to override my self-preservation instincts and force me back into the family dynamic I was trying to escape. A dying parent was the ultimate guilt trip, the one card they could play that would make my rebellion seem not just selfish, but monstrous. But I also recognized that this was exactly why I needed to leave. This manufactured crisis proved that they would use any tactic, exploit any weakness, create any emergency necessary to maintain their control over my life and resources. If I returned now, if I allowed this fake medical emergency to derail my escape, I would be proving to them that they could manipulate me indefinitely, that no boundary I tried to establish would be strong enough to withstand their psychological warfare. The gate agent announced the beginning of boarding for my flight, calling for first-class passengers and those needing special assistance. I stood up, gathered my carry-on bag, and walked toward the boarding line while my phone continued to buzz with increasingly desperate messages from family members who believed they were dealing with a genuine medical crisis, but were actually participating in an elaborate manipulation designed to prevent my liberation. Walking onto that plane, I chose my freedom over their lies, but I knew the real emotional warfare was just beginning. The moment the plane lifted off from Chicago, I felt a physical sensation of release that I hadn't expected, as if invisible chains I'd carried my entire life had suddenly fallen away. 14 hours later, when I stepped off the seaplane that had transported me from Malé International Airport to my resort, I experienced something I could only describe as pure vindication. The turquoise water stretching endlessly in every direction, the powdered sugar sand beaches, the overwater villa that would be my sanctuary for the next 5 days. This was what my money should have provided all along, instead of funding my family's manipulation schemes and lifestyle upgrades. The villa itself was more spectacular than even the resort's marketing photos had suggested. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a private lagoon where tropical fish darted through crystal-clear water, and a glass panel in the bedroom floor allowed me to watch marine life swimming directly beneath my bed. The bathroom featured a rainfall shower that opened directly onto my private deck, and the living area was appointed with luxury furnishings that probably cost more than my annual clothing budget. Most importantly, it was mine and mine alone. No children to supervise, no meals to prepare for ungrateful relatives, no manipulation tactics to navigate or emotional landmines to sidestep. I spent my first hour in paradise, simply walking through each room of the villa, documenting everything with my phone camera while simultaneously writing detailed descriptions in a leather journal I'd brought specifically for this purpose. Every photograph was carefully composed to capture not just the beauty of my surroundings, but the joy and liberation I felt at finally spending money on myself instead of subsidizing other people's dreams. The caption I wrote for my first Instagram post was deliberately pointed, "Sometimes you have to travel 8,000 miles to find yourself." The journal entries I wrote during those first few hours were unlike anything I'd ever recorded before. Raw, emotional, and brutally honest about the years of exploitation I'd finally escaped. December 23rd, 00 p.m. Maldives time, sitting on my private deck watching fish swim in water so clear it looks like liquid sapphire. For the first time in my adult life, I'm spending money on something that brings me pure joy instead of funding someone else's manipulation. This villa costs more per night than I've ever spent on myself in a month, and I don't feel guilty about it. I feel vindicated. Each meal became an opportunity to document my liberation through carefully curated social media posts. The champagne breakfast served on my deck while I watched sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The private beach picnic where I dined alone on lobster and tropical fruit, while my feet sank into sand so fine it felt like silk. The sunset dinner where I raised a glass of vintage wine to toast my own courage, while dolphins played in the distance. Every image was a deliberate declaration of independence, a visual manifesto announcing that I had finally chosen myself over family expectations. But even in paradise, the real world had ways of intruding on my carefully constructed escape. My phone, which I'd switched to international roaming specifically to document my triumph, began buzzing incessantly with emails from my office that grew increasingly urgent and threatening as the hours passed. The first message from my boss was relatively understanding. "Camila, hope your family emergency resolves quickly. Please call when you can to discuss Christmas Eve presentation coverage." By the second day, however, the tone had shifted dramatically. "This client meeting is career-defining for everyone involved. If you cannot be reached by end of business today, we'll have no choice but to assume you're unavailable for critical projects going forward." The implications were clear. My absence wasn't just disappointing, it was potentially career-ending. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was facing professional consequences for prioritizing my mental health and personal freedom, while my family faced no accountability whatsoever for their systematic financial abuse and emotional manipulation. Corporate America apparently had less tolerance for boundary setting than my relatives did for theft and psychological warfare. But as I read through increasingly threatening emails from colleagues who were scrambling to cover the presentation I should have been leading, I found myself surprisingly calm about the professional costs of my rebellion. Each evening, I established a ritual that felt like a form of meditation or prayer. I would position myself on my private deck with a cocktail that cost more than most people spent on dinner, watch the sun set over water that stretched to infinity, and process the emotional complexity of what I'd done. The guilt was still there. I wasn't sociopathic enough to feel nothing about abandoning family obligations or professional responsibilities. But underneath the guilt was something stronger and more sustaining, a deep sense of rightness about finally choosing my own well-being over everyone else's expectations. On my third evening, as I sat with a glass of champagne watching the sky transition through impossible shades of orange and purple, I composed what felt like a manifesto in my journal. I spent 27 years believing that being a good person meant sacrificing myself for others, that love required self-destruction, that family meant accepting whatever treatment they decided to give me. But sitting here in this paradise I bought with money they tried to steal, watching this sunset that exists just for me, I finally understand that self-respect isn't selfish. It's survival. The professional emails continued to accumulate, each one more dire than the last, painting pictures of disappointed clients and missed opportunities that would haunt my career trajectory for years to come. My boss's final message was particularly brutal. "Camila, your absence during this critical presentation has damaged client relationships and team morale in ways that cannot be easily repaired. When you return from whatever personal situation has taken precedence over your professional commitments, we'll need to have serious discussions about your future with this company." I had finally found paradise, but the price of psychological freedom was higher than I had calculated. The professional consequences of my rebellion felt abstract and distant as I sat in paradise, but I knew that 8,000 miles away, my family was experiencing the very real and immediate consequences of building their entire Christmas celebration around my unpaid labor. While I was documenting my liberation with champagne toasts and sunset photographs, they were discovering just how completely their holiday plans depended on my compliance, and I found myself oddly eager to learn about the chaos I'd left in my wake. The details of their Christmas Day disaster reached me through a series of increasingly frantic voicemails and text messages that painted a picture of complete organizational collapse. According to the scattered reports I pieced together from various family members, the catastrophe began early Christmas morning when Maria arrived at our parents' house to begin final preparations, only to discover that absolutely nothing had been prepared in advance, because everyone had assumed I would handle the logistics. The first crisis emerged around 9 in the morning when extended family members began arriving with their children, expecting the elaborate Italian feast that had been promised to them for weeks. Instead, they found an empty kitchen with no food preparation in progress, no catering setup, and no sign of the professional meal service that was supposed to provide Christmas dinner for 25 people. Maria, according to my mother's increasingly hysterical voicemails, spent the first hour of Christmas morning frantically calling restaurants and catering companies, only to discover that every establishment in the city was either closed for the holiday or completely booked with their own Christmas events. She kept insisting that there was supposed to be a caterer, my cousin Sarah reported in a text message that was clearly meant to make me feel guilty, but instead filled me with vindicated satisfaction. She had some business card for Nonna's kitchen, but the phone number just went to voicemail, and when Uncle Tony tried to look them up online, there was no website, no reviews, nothing. Maria was crying and screaming that you had arranged everything, but obviously something went wrong. The fictional catering company I'd created had performed exactly as intended, leaving my family with no food, no backup plan, and no understanding of how their elaborate Christmas celebration was supposed to materialize without my labor. But the food crisis was only the beginning of their problems, because without me there to supervise, coordinate, and manage the children, the entire family gathering devolved into pandemonium that no one else was equipped to handle. 9 children ranging in age from 3 to 14, all hyped up on Christmas excitement and sugar from early morning gift opening, created absolute chaos that overwhelmed the adults who had never bothered to learn basic childcare skills because they'd always relied on me to handle kid-related responsibilities. My nephew Tommy, age 5, decided to help himself to Christmas cookies from the kitchen counter and ended up pulling an entire tray of decorative ornaments down, with him shattering antique glass decorations that had been in my family for generations. The 3-year-old twins got into a screaming fight over identical toys and began throwing wrapped presents at each other, while the older kids started an impromptu food fight with the appetizers that were supposed to tide everyone over until dinner. The house looked like a war zone. Rachel texted me, apparently oblivious to the irony of complaining about chaos to the person whose absence had created it. Kids running everywhere, crying, screaming, breaking things. Mom and Dad just stood there looking overwhelmed while Maria tried to manage everyone at once. Nobody knew what to do because you always handled the kids during family gatherings. But it was Aunt Linda's public confrontation with my mother that apparently transformed the private family disaster into a humiliating spectacle that would be discussed in our extended family for years to come. According to multiple accounts from different relatives, the confrontation occurred around noon when it became clear that no food was forthcoming and the children's behavior had spiraled completely out of control. This disaster is what happens when you build your plans around exploiting family instead of planning responsibly, Linda had announced in front of the entire gathering, her voice loud enough to ensure that every guest could hear her assessment of the situation. You've spent years treating Camilla like hired help instead of a daughter, taking her money, stealing her time, and assuming she'd always be available to clean up your messes. Well, congratulations. Now you get to see what Christmas looks like when you actually have to handle your own responsibilities. And the public nature of Linda's criticism, delivered in front of cousins, family, friends, and extended relatives who had been invited to witness what was supposed to be a perfect family celebration, transformed the private dysfunction into a community spectacle. Guests who had arrived expecting an elegant Italian feast found themselves witnessing a family meltdown with screaming children, frazzled adults, and no food in sight, while the hosting family argued about whose fault it was that their celebration had collapsed so completely. My father, apparently desperate to salvage some semblance of hospitality, called every pizza delivery service in the area, until he found one willing to work on Christmas Day, ultimately serving Domino's pizza to 25 relatives who had been promised a gourmet holiday meal. The image of my parents passing around cardboard pizza boxes, while their guests whispered about the obvious planning failures and family dysfunction, was so perfectly representative of their entire approach to relationships, all appearance and manipulation with no substance or genuine care underneath. Everyone was talking about how weird it was that you just disappeared? My cousin Jennifer texted, apparently not realizing how her message highlighted the family's complete dependence on my labor. Like, people kept asking where you were and why nothing was organized, and Mom and Dad couldn't give a straight answer. It was really uncomfortable for everyone. Their perfect family Christmas was collapsing in humiliating real time while my new life was just beginning to bloom in paradise. The reports of their Christmas Day catastrophe filled me with a satisfaction so complete that I felt almost guilty about how much I was enjoying their humiliation, but that guilt evaporated entirely when the real emotional assault began. As news of their organizational collapse spread through our extended family and their social circle, my phone transformed into a weapon of psychological warfare, buzzing constantly with increasingly desperate attempts to drag me back into their dysfunction through sheer emotional manipulation. My mother's voicemail campaign began on Christmas evening and escalated with a ferocity that would have been impressive if it weren't so pathologically manipulative. The first message was relatively restrained, her voice tight with controlled anger as she demanded to know where I was and why I had abandoned the family during their time of need. By the third message, the control had slipped, and her voice carried the sharp edge of genuine panic as she described the humiliation I'd caused by leaving them without support during their most important family gathering of the year. Message 15 marked the transition into pure emotional manipulation, with my mother's voice breaking as she sobbed about how my absence had ruined Christmas for everyone, especially the children who kept asking for their Aunt Camila. Message 23 featured screaming accusations about my selfish betrayal and how I had destroyed years of family traditions by choosing my own interests over family loyalty. By message 30, she was alternating between rage and fake vulnerability, her voice cycling through emotional extremes that would have been convincing if I hadn't spent decades learning to recognize her manipulation tactics. The voicemails that came after midnight were particularly unhinged, with my mother apparently drinking wine while leaving increasingly incoherent messages about family sacrifice, ungrateful children, and the years of love and support I was repaying with cruelty. Message 47, left at 3 a.m, was pure stream of consciousness rambling about how much money they'd spent on my education and how I owed them decades of gratitude and service. Message 52. The final one in her 24-hour campaign was delivered in a whisper that was somehow more threatening than her screaming, promising that my betrayal would have consequences you can't imagine. Maria's approach was more strategically calculated, but equally desperate, beginning with text messages that tried to frame my absence as a misunderstanding that could still be resolved if I returned immediately. "We know you're upset about something, but running away isn't the solution," she wrote in her first message. Family works through problems together, not by abandoning each other when things get difficult. When I didn't respond to her reasonable approach, she escalated to threats about the permanent damage I was causing to family relationships. "You're destroying family unity with this selfish tantrum," she texted around midnight Christmas night. "The kids are traumatized, the adults are humiliated, and you're somewhere having fun while your family suffers. This betrayal will follow you for the rest of your life because everyone sees who you really are now." Her messages became increasingly venomous as she realized that guilt and threats weren't compelling me to respond, culminating in accusations that I was mentally ill and needed professional help to understand the magnitude of my cruelty. But Maria's most sophisticated manipulation tactic involved weaponizing the children's emotions against me, coaching them to record tearful video messages designed to break down my resolve through pure emotional devastation. The first video showed my 8-year-old niece crying as she asked why Aunt Camilla didn't love her enough to spend Christmas together. The second featured my nephew explaining that he'd made me a special drawing that was now sitting unopened under the Christmas tree because I'd chosen to go away instead of celebrating with the family. Each video was expertly crafted to maximize emotional impact, with the children's genuine confusion and sadness manipulated into weapons against my psychological defenses. Maria had clearly coached them on what to say, feeding them phrases about abandonment and broken promises that no child would naturally use, but their tears were real and their hurt was authentic, making the videos particularly cruel in their effectiveness at exploiting my love for them to serve her agenda. Rachel's phone call came on December 26th, her voice shaking with panic as she revealed information that recontextualized months of family interactions. "Camila, I need to tell you something and I don't know how you're going to react." She began, her words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and desperation. "I've been telling Maria about your plans and your conversations with me for months. She asked me to keep track of your mood and your reactions to family requests, and I thought I was helping maintain family harmony." The revelation that Rachel had been functioning as a spy within my support system was devastating, but not entirely surprising given the level of strategic planning I'd discovered in my mother's files. Rachel had been reporting on my growing resistance to family demands, my questions about money, and my increasingly obvious frustration with their expectations. Providing Maria and my mother with intelligence, they used to adjust their manipulation tactics. "I thought if I told them when you were getting overwhelmed, they could back off a little and prevent you from getting upset." Rachel continued, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine remorse. "But instead of helping, they used the information to plan bigger demands and more elaborate guilt trips. And now they're blaming me for not warning them that you were planning to leave, as if I should have known you were capable of something this dramatic." The irony that Rachel was now receiving the same blame and emotional abuse she'd helped them direct at me would have been amusing if it weren't so perfectly illustrative of their family dynamic. They created chaos and conflict, then blamed whoever was most convenient for the predictable consequences of their manipulation. As I floated in the crystal-clear lagoon beside my overwater villa, my phone propped on the deck where I could see the constant stream of notifications without being compelled to respond to them, I felt a sense of power and control that I'd never experienced before. Each ignored voicemail, each unanswered text, each declined phone call was a small act of rebellion that reinforced my newfound boundaries and reminded me that I had choices they couldn't take away. Their growing desperation became the soundtrack to my liberation, but I sensed the real emotional storm was still approaching. The emotional bombardment continued for 3 days with clockwork precision, each family member taking shifts in their attempts to break down my resolve through increasingly sophisticated psychological warfare. But it was my father's call on December 28th that finally provided the breakthrough I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for, the moment when their desperation would overcome their strategic thinking and lead to the kind of confession that would change everything between us forever. I had been ignoring calls all morning while enjoying a private yoga session on my villa deck when my phone rang for the 15th time in an hour, displaying my father's contact information. Something about the persistence felt different this time, more urgent and less calculated than the previous attempts, and I found myself curious about what new manipulation tactic they might be deploying. Against my better judgment, I decided to answer partly because I wanted to hear firsthand how they were justifying their Christmas catastrophe, and partly because I felt strong enough in my paradise sanctuary to handle whatever emotional weapon they chose to wield. "Camila, thank God you finally answered." His voice was thick with what sounded like genuine distress, not the calculated emotional manipulation I'd grown accustomed to hearing from my family. "We need to talk about what's happening here, about the damage your disappearance is causing to everyone who loves you." I activated the recording function on my phone before responding, a habit I'd developed since discovering the extent of their manipulation planning. "I'm listening," I said, simply settling into the comfortable lounge chair where I'd spent the morning reading and sipping tropical fruit smoothies. What followed was 20 minutes of the most emotionally raw conversation I'd ever had with my father, as the stress of managing their financial and social crisis apparently broke down whatever barriers he'd maintained around discussing their private business. He began with familiar guilt tactics about family loyalty and shared responsibility. But as his frustration with my continued silence grew, his careful language began deteriorating into increasingly revealing admissions. "You don't understand the position you've put us in," he said, his voice rising with agitation. "This isn't just about Christmas dinner or babysitting. Your mother and I have been counting on your financial stability for years to help us maintain the lifestyle this family deserves. When you disappear like this, when you abandon your responsibilities, you're not just hurting feelings, you're threatening our entire financial foundation." The admission was startling in its honesty, but it was just the beginning of what became a complete breakdown of the careful boundaries they'd maintained around discussing money. As his emotional control continued to slip, my father began revealing details about their financial arrangements that I'd never suspected, painting a picture of systematic exploitation that went far deeper than the unauthorized transfers I'd already discovered. "Maria's car loan, for instance," he continued, apparently unaware that he was confessing to financial fraud. "We needed your credit score to get her the interest rate she deserved, so we put your name on the loan as a co-signer. You were busy with work and didn't need to be bothered with the details, but your excellent credit saved the family thousands of dollars in interest payments." My hands began shaking as I processed this revelation. Maria's car loan, a significant monthly payment that I'd never known existed, was legally my responsibility. If she defaulted on payments, my credit would be destroyed, and I could be held liable for the entire remaining balance. They had used my financial stability as collateral for her lifestyle upgrade without my knowledge or consent. But the car loan was apparently just the beginning of their financial exploitation scheme. "And the mortgage refinancing we did last year." My father continued, his voice becoming more frantic as he realized I wasn't responding with understanding or forgiveness. "We were able to get a much better rate by adding you as a co-borrower, which meant we could access the equity we needed for some important family investments. Your income and credit history made all the difference in qualifying for the terms we wanted." The magnitude of what he was revealing hit me like a physical blow. They had refinanced their mortgage with me as a co-borrower, making me legally responsible for their housing debt without my knowledge. My excellent credit, my steady income, my financial responsibility had been used as leverage to secure loans that I'd never agreed to and never benefited from. "The medical bills from your mother's surgery 2 years ago," he added, apparently completely unaware that each revelation was digging him deeper into a confession of financial abuse. "The insurance didn't cover everything, and we needed someone with good credit to co-sign for the payment plan with the hospital. You were the obvious choice because you care about family, and you had the financial stability to handle the responsibility if anything went wrong." I was frantically taking notes while recording, trying to capture every detail of what was becoming the most comprehensive confession of financial manipulation I could have hoped for. My father was systematically revealing years of fraudulent use of my credit, my income, and my financial reputation to secure benefits for family members who had never consulted me about the risks they were transferring to my name. The total amount we've been able to save and access through your financial participation is probably close to $50,000 over the past 3 years. He said, apparently proud of their efficiency in exploiting my resources. Your excellent credit score, your stable employment, your responsible financial history. These are family assets that should benefit everyone, not just you. That's what family means: sharing resources and supporting each other through financial partnerships. The casual way he described financial fraud as family partnerships would have been comical if the implications weren't so devastating. I had been unknowingly responsible for nearly $50,000 in family debt accumulated through loans and financial arrangements I'd never agreed to or even been informed about. My pristine credit history, something I'd worked years to establish and maintain, had been their secret weapon in securing financial benefits that I'd never received. I laughed out loud at the audacity of his confession, a sound so bitter and sharp that it apparently startled him into silence. Are you seriously telling me that you've been using my credit and my financial information to secure loans without my knowledge, and you think that's normal family behavior? I asked, my voice steady, despite the rage building in my chest. His breakdown confession was my legal smoking gun, but using this evidence would mean declaring total war on my entire family. My father's financial confession left me reeling with a combination of vindication and fury that took hours to fully process. But it was the phone call that came 12 hours later that truly shattered whatever remained of my illusions about my family's capacity for manipulation. Emma, my 16-year-old cousin and Maria's eldest daughter, called me at 2 a.m. Maldives time. Her voice thick with tears and guilt as she delivered what would become the most devastating revelation of my entire escape. Camila, I can't sleep, and I can't stop thinking about what happened at Christmas. She began, her words coming out in a rush of adolescent emotion and moral clarity that cut through years of adult manipulation with surgical precision. I need to tell you something, and I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. But I can't keep pretending anymore after seeing how upset everyone got when you didn't show up. I settled deeper into my villa's comfortable seating area, watching moonlight reflect off the lagoon while preparing myself for whatever confession this child felt compelled to make. Emma had always been my favorite among the children, the most intellectually curious and emotionally perceptive, and I'd spent countless hours helping her with school projects and listening to her navigate the typical dramas of teenage life. My mom told me to pretend I desperately needed your help with my college application essays. She said, her voice breaking with shame and regret. She said you were starting to ask too many questions about family responsibilities and getting resistant to helping out, so we needed to make you feel more important and needed. She coached me on exactly what to say about being overwhelmed with deadlines and how much I valued your advice, and how you were the only person smart enough to help me get into my dream college. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, not just because of the manipulation itself, but because of how perfectly it had worked on my emotions. I remembered those conversations with Emma about her college applications, how proud and useful I'd felt when she asked for my guidance, how honored I was to be the adult she trusted with her academic future. The entire interaction had been orchestrated by Maria to exploit my desire to be meaningful in the children's lives, transforming what I'd believed was a genuine relationship into another tool of family manipulation. She made me practice the conversations beforehand. Emma continued, her teenage voice wavering between anger at being used and guilt about participating in the deception. She would role-play being you and make me rehearse the exact phrases that would make you feel most needed. Things like, "You're the smartest person in our family," and "I don't know what I'd do without your help," and "You understand me better than my own parents." She said these were the key phrases that would make you feel emotionally invested in helping the family. I felt physically sick as I processed the calculated nature of what Emma was describing. Maria hadn't just used her daughter as a manipulation tool. She had conducted psychological research on my emotional vulnerabilities and trained a teenager to exploit them with scientific precision. The conversations I'd treasured as evidence of my positive impact on Emma's life had been scripted performances designed to ensure my continued compliance with family demands. It wasn't just me, Emma added, apparently determined to expose the full scope of the manipulation system she'd been forced to participate in. Mom coached all of us kids on different approaches that would work best with your personality. The little ones were taught to be extra affectionate and clingy to tell you how much they missed you when you weren't around. The middle kids were given specific problems to bring to you. Homework they supposedly couldn't understand, friend drama that supposedly only you could help them navigate. We were all assigned different roles in making you feel indispensable. The systematic nature of their manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication and heartbreaking in its exploitation of innocent children who should have been protected from adult psychological warfare rather than conscripted into it. My family had created an entire network of child manipulators, each trained to exploit different aspects of my emotional attachment to them, for the ultimate goal of maintaining my compliance with adult demands. The worst part? Emma said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more moral authority than any of the adults in her life seemed to possess, is how the grown-ups talk about you when they think we're not listening. They discuss managing Camila like you're a problem to be solved instead of a person with feelings. They analyze your reactions, plan strategies for getting you to agree to things, and laugh about how predictable your responses are to their requests. This revelation about being discussed as a case study in family manipulation was almost more devastating than the financial fraud or the systematic exploitation of my labor. To know that my emotional responses, my psychological patterns, my deepest vulnerabilities had been analyzed and cataloged by people who claimed to love me was a violation so profound that I felt fundamentally changed by the knowledge. Mom always says things like, if we approach Camila this way, she'll feel guilty and give us what we want, or Camila's weakness is thinking she's not doing enough for family, so we can use that, Emma continued, apparently determined to expose every aspect of the psychological warfare she'd witnessed. They talk about your emotions like they're buttons on a machine that they've learned how to push to get specific results. Emma went on to describe years of family meetings where my behavior was analyzed, my motivations dissected, and my emotional responses strategically planned around, like weather patterns that could be predicted and exploited. The children had been forced to witness these discussions about psychological manipulation, learning that healthy family relationships were built on calculated exploitation rather than mutual respect and genuine care. I started feeling sick about it when I got older and realized what was actually happening. She said, her voice gaining strength as she moved from confession toward moral clarity. Like normal families don't have strategy meetings about how to emotionally manipulate their relatives. Normal people don't coach their kids to lie about needing help just to make adults feel useful. But I was scared to say anything, because I didn't want the grown-ups to be mad at me. The conversation with Emma lasted for over an hour, as she systematically dismantled my understanding of every genuine interaction I thought I'd had with the children in my family over the past several years. Birthday cards with messages that had been dictated by parents. Holiday gifts chosen specifically to reinforce my sense of importance in their lives. Even casual conversations that had been guided by adult coaching about topics that would make me feel most emotionally connected to their well-being. They had transformed even the children into tools of emotional warfare, and that revelation made my escape feel like salvation. Emma's devastating revelations about the systematic weaponization of children in my family's manipulation campaign left me emotionally drained but also strangely liberated, as if each confession was cutting another chain that had bound me to their toxic system. I spent the next morning processing her words while floating in my private lagoon, trying to reconcile the innocent relationships I thought I'd built with the children against the calculated deceptions their parents had orchestrated. But it was an unexpected email that arrived that afternoon that provided the most shocking validation of my decision to escape. External confirmation from someone who had been silently documenting my exploitation for years, Mrs. Henderson. My elderly neighbor from the apartment building next to my parents' house had somehow obtained my email address and sent a message with the subject line, "About your family situation. Important information." I remembered her as a quiet, observant woman in her 70s, who tended an impressive garden and always greeted me politely during my frequent visits to my parents' house, but I'd never imagined she was paying close attention to the family dynamics she witnessed from her kitchen window. "Dear Camila," her email began, "I hope you'll forgive an old woman for reaching out to you during what I imagine is a difficult time. I obtained your email address from your LinkedIn profile because I felt compelled to share some information that might be helpful to you as you navigate whatever situation has caused your recent absence from family gatherings." The formal tone of her message suggested something more serious than neighborly concern, and as I continued reading from my Villa deck, I realized I was about to receive intelligence about my family's behavior from a completely objective outside observer who had no emotional investment in maintaining family harmony or protecting anyone's feelings. "I want you to know that I've been keeping a detailed diary of the interactions I've witnessed between you and your family members for over 2 years now," she continued, "because what I observed troubled me greatly as someone who raised 4 children and understands healthy family dynamics. I began documenting these patterns because I suspected that what I was seeing might eventually require outside intervention or legal support." The idea that a virtual stranger had been systematically recording my family's treatment of me was both shocking and deeply validating, Mrs. Henderson had no reason to fabricate evidence or exaggerate situations. She was simply an elderly woman who had recognized dysfunction and felt compelled to document it for reasons that apparently went beyond casual neighborhood gossip. Her email included attachments that made my hands shake as I opened them on my phone. The first was a scanned page from what appeared to be a bound notebook filled with neat handwriting that detailed dates, times, and specific observations about my visits to my parents' house. March 15th, 7:30 p.m. Camila arrived with multiple grocery bags and cleaning supplies. Observed her carrying laundry baskets and what appeared to be meal preparation containers. No other family members visible helping with unloading or carrying items. The clinical precision of her documentation was stunning. She had recorded my arrivals and departures, noting the supplies I brought the duration of my visits, and the activities she could observe through windows or in the driveway. April 3rd, 8:00 a.m., 9:00 p.m. Camila's car in driveway for 13 consecutive hours. Observed her in backyard hanging laundry cleaning windows and supervising children while adults remained inside house. She appeared to be handling all outdoor maintenance and childcare responsibilities alone. Page after page of her diary revealed a pattern that was even more disturbing when viewed through the eyes of an objective observer than it had felt while I was living through it. Mrs. Henderson had documented my weekend-long visits, where I provided what amounted to domestic service, while other family members relaxed, socialized, or left the property entirely. Her notes captured details I'd forgotten, the specific dates when I'd arrived before dawn to prepare for family gatherings, the times I'd stayed past midnight cleaning up after events I hadn't been invited to enjoy. June 12th, Father's Day. Camila arrived at 6:00 a.m. with party supplies and decorated entire backyard for family celebration. Observed her setting up tables, arranging food, and managing all logistics while family members slept in. During the actual party, 2:00 p.m., 8:00 p.m., she was continuously serving cleaning and supervising children while other adults socialized and relaxed. She was the last to leave at 10:30 p.m. carrying leftover food and party cleanup supplies to her car. The documentation continued through seasons and holidays, creating an undeniable record of systematic exploitation that no one could dismiss as my imagination or emotional exaggeration, Mrs. Henderson had captured the financial aspect as well, noting when I arrived with expensive groceries, gifts, or supplies that I'd obviously purchased for family events. Her diary included estimates of the value of items I brought, the hours of labor I provided, and the stark contrast between my contributions and my treatment during family gatherings. What concerned me most, her email continued, was not just the amount of work you were doing, but the way other family members treated your contributions as invisible or expected rather than appreciated. I watched numerous gatherings where you provided all the preparation and cleanup, while others took credit for hosting successful events. Multiple neighbors on our street have commented privately about that poor girl being systematically used by her own family, but we felt unable to interfere in what appeared to be family business. The revelation that multiple neighbors had noticed and discussed my exploitation was both humiliating and vindicating. I had spent years believing that my family's treatment of me was normal, that my exhaustion and resentment were signs of my own inadequacy, rather than reasonable responses to systematic abuse. But outside observers with no emotional investment in maintaining family harmony had recognized the dysfunction immediately and felt compelled to document it because it was so obviously problematic. Mrs. Henderson's email concluded with an offer that felt like a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. If you ever require written testimony about the behavioral patterns I've witnessed over these 2 years, I would be happy to provide a formal statement with specific dates, times, and detailed observations. I've also spoken with other neighbors who share my concerns and would be willing to support your position if legal or family interventions become necessary. I wasn't losing my mind. An entire community had been documenting my exploitation, and now they were ready to speak the truth. Mrs. Henderson's detailed documentation provided the external validation I hadn't realized I desperately needed, but it also motivated me to dig deeper into the financial reality behind my family's desperation. Their increasingly frantic attempts to manipulate me back into compliance suggested something more urgent than simple inconvenience at losing their unpaid helper. Their behavior indicated genuine panic about consequences that went far beyond hurt feelings or social embarrassment. Armed with the knowledge that objective observers had been documenting their exploitation patterns, I decided to investigate the true scope of their financial dependency on my contributions. The internet connection in my overwater villa was surprisingly robust, allowing me to access public records and financial databases that revealed information I'd never thought to research during my years of naive compliance. Property records for my grandmother's house showed a complex web of mortgages, refinancing agreements, and liens that painted a picture of systematic financial desperation stretching back several years. The most recent filing, dated just 6 weeks ago, was a foreclosure notice indicating that my parents had missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments and faced legal proceedings to reclaim the property. Cook County Court records revealed additional layers of their financial crisis that explained the calculated nature of their manipulation campaign. My father's landscaping business, which I'd always assumed was modestly successful, based on his casual references to clients and projects, had actually filed for bankruptcy protection 3 years ago. The business closure coincided exactly with the timeline when my financial contributions to family events had increased dramatically, when the emergency childcare requests had become a weekly occurrence, and when various relatives had begun treating my resources as family assets available for collective use. Legal documents showed that the business failure had triggered a cascade of financial problems that my parents had been concealing behind a facade of middle-class stability. Credit card judgments, unpaid medical bills, and defaulted personal loans created a debt load that would have destroyed most families' financial foundation. But my unwitting contributions had apparently provided enough supplemental income to maintain the illusion of solvency while they systematically liquidated every asset they could access. The most devastating revelation came from property tax records that showed my parents hadn't made a full property tax payment on grandmother's house in over 18 months. The accumulated debt, including penalties and interest, totaled nearly $12,000 and was scheduled for tax sale proceedings in March, less than 3 months away. Without immediate payment of the full amount, the house would be auctioned to satisfy the tax debt, and my parents would lose the property that represented not just their housing, but their only remaining asset of any value. Cross-referencing these public records with my father's drunken financial confession revealed the complete picture of their dependency on my resources. The mortgage payments they'd been making sporadically were funded by the mysterious transfers from my savings account that I'd discovered weeks ago. Maria's car loan, which they'd fraudulently secured using my credit, was being paid through direct manipulation of my financial accounts. Even their basic living expenses, utilities, groceries, insurance premiums, had been partially subsidized by my contributions to family events that always seemed to require more expensive preparations than the occasions warranted. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel that inadvertently confirmed my worst suspicions about their financial desperation. "Mom is having panic attacks about the house situation." She wrote, apparently unaware that her message was providing crucial intelligence about their private financial discussions. "She keeps saying they have until March to figure something out, or they'll lose everything. Dad won't tell us exactly what's wrong, but it sounds like they owe money they don't have for taxes or something." The timeline was stark and unforgiving. Without my financial contributions, my parents faced complete economic collapse within 12 weeks. They would lose my grandmother's house to tax foreclosure default on the fraudulent loans they'd secured using my credit and face potential bankruptcy proceedings that would destroy whatever remained of their financial reputation. The manipulation campaign they'd orchestrated wasn't just about maintaining convenient access to free labor and supplemental income. It was about survival. But understanding their desperation also clarified the true scope of power I'd accidentally accumulated through my escape. By removing myself from their financial ecosystem, by cutting off the flow of resources they'd been systematically extracting from my accounts and credit history, I had inadvertently triggered a crisis that threatened to destroy them completely. The nuclear option I hadn't realized I was deploying by disappearing to the Maldives was already in motion, counting down toward consequences that would be irreversible once the legal deadlines expired. The moral complexity of this realization kept me awake that night, staring at stars reflected in the lagoon, while grappling with questions I'd never imagined having to answer. Did protecting myself from further exploitation require allowing them to face complete financial ruin? Was there a middle path between continued victimization and total destruction of the people who had raised me? However poorly they'd treated me as an adult, could I establish healthy boundaries without wielding the ultimate weapon of their complete economic collapse? Part of me felt deeply satisfied by the justice of their situation. They had systematically stolen from me for years, and now they were facing consequences for building their lifestyle on unsustainable exploitation. But another part of me recognized that allowing them to lose everything would create suffering that extended beyond just the family members who had manipulated me. The children I'd grown to love, despite learning about their weaponization and manipulation schemes, would be displaced and traumatized by the loss of their grandparents' home and the family crisis that would follow. Yet every time I considered intervening to save them from financial ruin, I remembered the calculated cruelty of their manipulation strategies, the years of psychological warfare they'd waged against my sense of self-worth, the systematic theft of resources I'd earned through my own hard work and responsible financial planning. They had created this crisis through their own choices, their own financial irresponsibility, their own decision to build their security on exploitation rather than sustainable planning. I held their financial survival in my hands, and for the first time in my life, they needed me far more than I needed them. The weight of holding my family's financial future in my hands occupied my thoughts during the 18-hour flight home from paradise. But nothing could have prepared me for the dramatic confrontation that awaited me at my apartment building on December 29th. I had expected phone calls, perhaps a visit from one or two family members seeking to negotiate or manipulate me back into compliance. But what I encountered when my taxi pulled up to my building was a full-scale family invasion that had apparently been planned with military precision. My entire extended family was gathered in the lobby of my apartment building like an army preparing for siege warfare. My parents stood near the elevator bank, my mother clutching tissues and my father pacing with barely controlled agitation. Maria occupied the seating area with her husband and children, while Rachel hovered near the front desk, apparently trying to convince building management to grant them access to my floor. Aunt Linda and several cousins I rarely saw outside of major holidays filled the remaining space, creating a crowd that had clearly disrupted the normally quiet atmosphere of my building. The scene was so theatrical, so obviously orchestrated for maximum emotional impact, that I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. They had transformed my private residence into the setting for a public intervention, apparently believing that staging their manipulation campaign in front of witnesses would somehow make it more compelling or harder for me to resist. Instead, their decision to bring family drama into a space where my neighbors and building staff could observe their behavior was providing me with exactly the kind of external validation I hadn't realized I needed. Building security approached me as I entered the lobby with my luggage, clearly relieved to see the person who could potentially resolve the disruption these people had been creating. "Ms. Rodriguez, these individuals claim to be your family and have been requesting access to your apartment for over an hour. They've been quite persistent about the urgency of speaking with you." Before I could respond, my mother launched into what was clearly a rehearsed performance designed to garner sympathy from the growing audience of curious residents and building staff. "Camila, thank God you're finally here. We've been so worried about you disappearing without telling anyone where you were going or when you'd be back. We thought something terrible had happened to you." The theatrical concern in her voice was undermined by the obvious coordination of their group presence and the strategic way they'd positioned themselves throughout the lobby to maximize the visual impact of their intervention. This wasn't the behavior of genuinely worried family members. This was a calculated campaign designed to pressure me into compliance through public shame and emotional manipulation. What surprised me most was my own reaction to their dramatic display. Instead of the familiar rush of guilt and anxiety that had always accompanied family confrontations in the past, I felt a strange sense of calm detachment, as if I were observing their performance from a great distance. The 5 days I'd spent in paradise, the external validation I'd received from Mrs. Henderson's documentation, and the shocking revelations about their financial desperation had fundamentally changed my relationship to their manipulation tactics. Emma, who had been standing quietly beside Maria's chair, suddenly broke away from the family group and walked directly to me with a determination that clearly surprised the adults who had been orchestrating this intervention. At 16, she was tall enough to look me directly in the eyes as she spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear clearly. "Camila, I want everyone here to know that you're my role model for choosing yourself over toxic people," she announced, her teenage voice carrying more moral authority than any of the adults present seemed to possess. "What you did took incredible courage, and I hope I'm brave enough to set boundaries like that when I'm older, and people try to take advantage of me." The silence that followed Emma's declaration was profound and telling. My family had clearly not anticipated that one of their own children would publicly validate my position rather than participate in the guilt campaign they'd orchestrated. Emma's statement reframed the entire confrontation from a story about my selfish abandonment of family obligations to a narrative about healthy boundary setting and self-protection against exploitation. Maria's face turned red with embarrassment and rage as she realized her own daughter was undermining their carefully planned intervention. "Emma, you don't understand the complexity of family relationships," she hissed, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone whose manipulation strategy was falling apart in real time. "Camila has responsibilities and commitments that she's abandoned, and her behavior has hurt a lot of people who love her." But Emma's public support had apparently given me a strength I didn't know I possessed, because instead of feeling defensive about Maria's accusations, I found myself genuinely curious about the spectacle they were creating. "Are you seriously staging an intervention in my apartment lobby because I went on vacation without asking your permission?" I asked, my voice calm and genuinely puzzled by the theatricality of their approach. My question seemed to trigger the emotional meltdown they'd apparently been building toward, as my parents began alternating between different manipulation tactics with a desperation that was becoming obvious to the growing audience of witnesses. My father launched into screaming accusations about my selfishness and ingratitude, his voice echoing off the lobby walls while residents waiting for elevators stared in fascination at the family drama unfolding before them. My mother immediately shifted to theatrical sobbing, pulling tissues from her purse while describing her heartbreak at my cruel abandonment during the holidays. The performance was so obviously calculated that I could see building staff exchanging glances of recognition, They had clearly witnessed enough family dysfunction to identify manipulation tactics when they saw them. Maria's approach was the most sophisticated, alternating between wounded victimhood and veiled threats, while maintaining a voice pitched for maximum auditory impact. If this is how you want to treat the people who raised you and supported you your entire life, then maybe it's time to make this separation permanent. She announced, her words clearly intended to frighten me with the prospect of total family rejection. Some betrayals are so deep that they permanently destroy relationships, and what you've done might be unforgivable. But instead of the panic and desperate capitulation they were clearly expecting, I felt an unexpected sense of liberation at the prospect they were threatening. The idea of permanent separation from people who had systematically exploited my resources and manipulated my emotions wasn't terrifying. It was remarkably appealing. Standing in my own doorway surrounded by chaos, I realized I was no longer their victim. I had become their judge and jury. The realization that I had transformed from victim to judge seemed to embolden my family's desperation, triggering what appeared to be their final coordinated assault on my psychological defenses. My mother stepped forward from the group, her posture straightening into the authoritative stance I remembered from childhood, when she was preparing to deliver one of her most devastating lectures about disappointment and family shame. "Camila, I think it's time for some hard truths about what you've done to this family," she began. Her voice projected loud enough to ensure that every resident and staff member in the lobby could hear her words clearly. "Your shameful, selfish behavior over the past week has destroyed our family's reputation in the entire community. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to explain to 25 relatives and family friends why our Christmas celebration turned into a disaster? Do you understand that people are talking about us, whispering about our family dysfunction, questioning how we raised you?" Her speech had the polished quality of something she'd rehearsed extensively, each phrase calculated for maximum emotional impact and public sympathy. She gestured dramatically as she spoke, playing to the audience of strangers who had become unwilling witnesses to our family crisis. But instead of the crushing shame her words would have triggered just weeks earlier, I found myself analyzing her performance with the detached interest of someone studying a psychological case study. "We've spent 27 years investing in your success, supporting your education, providing you with opportunities that allowed you to build the career and lifestyle you enjoy today," she continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "And this is how you repay that love and sacrifice, by abandoning us when we needed you most, by disappearing to some exotic vacation while your family struggled to manage the crisis you created." Maria immediately seized the momentum my mother had established, stepping forward to deliver her own carefully prepared monologue about sacrifice and family obligation. Her performance was even more theatrical than my mother's, with gestures and vocal inflections that seemed designed to evoke sympathy from the growing audience of observers. "I want everyone here to understand what real family sacrifice looks like," Maria announced, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion, but which I now recognized as expertly manipulated theatrical technique. "I've spent years putting my family's needs ahead of my own desires, working multiple jobs to provide for my children, making countless personal sacrifices to ensure that our family stays connected and supportive of each other." The irony of Maria lecturing anyone about family sacrifice while conveniently ignoring her own years of systematically exploiting my labor and resources was so profound that I had to suppress an inappropriate urge to laugh. She had transformed her children into manipulation tools, used my financial stability to fund her lifestyle upgrades, and weaponized family guilt to extract free childcare services. But she was now positioning herself as the moral authority on family duty and selflessness. "Family means showing up for each other, especially during difficult times," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she warmed to her theme. "It means putting the needs of people you love ahead of your own comfort and convenience. It means understanding that sometimes love requires sacrifice, and that the bonds between family members are more important than individual desires or personal fulfillment." My father chose this moment to deploy what was clearly his designated role in their coordinated emotional assault. The wounded patriarch whose authority and wisdom had been disrespected by an ungrateful child. His approach was quieter than the women's theatrical performances, but designed to cut deeper through its appeal to traditional family hierarchies and generational respect. "Camila, I'm not going to shout or make dramatic speeches," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment and moral authority. "But I need you to understand that family should be everything to you, and you've chosen money and luxury over the people who raised you with love and dedication. Your grandmother, if she were alive to see this behavior, would be heartbroken by the person you've become." The invocation of my grandmother, whose house and inheritance they had systematically stolen to fund their own lifestyle, was so audacious that it nearly broke my composure entirely. He was using the memory of the woman whose final gift they had liquidated without my knowledge to guilt me into returning to their exploitation system, transforming her into a weapon against the boundaries I'd finally learned to establish. "We didn't raise you to be selfish," he continued, his voice growing stronger as he sensed what he probably interpreted as weakness in my continued silence. "We taught you about family loyalty, about putting others' needs ahead of your own, about understanding that love sometimes requires personal sacrifice. But somewhere along the way you've forgotten those values and chosen individual pleasure over family responsibility." As I listened to their coordinated performances, I became acutely aware of Emma standing slightly apart from the adult group, her expression conflicted as she watched her family members deploy every manipulation tactic they'd perfected over decades of practice. Her earlier public support for my boundaries had clearly surprised and dismayed the adults, but I could see the internal struggle playing out across her teenage features as she processed the emotional warfare being directed at someone she'd declared her role model. The momentary guilt I felt watching Emma's obvious discomfort was sharp and familiar, triggering the same protective instincts that had kept me trapped in cycles of exploitation for years. Part of me wanted to capitulate to spare this innocent teenager from witnessing the complete dissolution of her extended family, to return to my role as the accommodating aunt who absorbed dysfunction to maintain surface harmony. But as I watched Emma's conflicted expression, I realized that witnessing this confrontation might actually be the most valuable gift I could give her. A real-time demonstration that adults who use manipulation, guilt, and emotional coercion could be resisted, that healthy boundaries were possible even when maintaining them required tremendous courage. My capitulation would teach her that family manipulation always succeeded if applied with sufficient intensity, but my resistance would show her that self-respect was worth defending, even against overwhelming emotional pressure. Their emotional weapons were the same psychological chains that had bound me for 27 years, but I had finally discovered how to break free. The breaking of those psychological chains felt like stepping out of a cage I'd carried my entire life, but it also unleashed a calm determination that surprised me with its intensity. As my family's emotional performances reached their crescendo in my apartment lobby, I realized I was no longer interested in defending myself against their accusations or trying to justify my choices to people who had systematically exploited me for years. Instead, I was ready to present the evidence that would transform this public confrontation from their manipulation theater into my courtroom. I pulled my phone from my purse with deliberate slowness, giving them time to notice the device and wonder what I intended to do with it. The lobby had grown quieter as residents and building staff sensed that the family drama was building toward some kind of climax, and I could feel the attention of every witness focusing on my next move. "Since you're all here making public speeches about family values and my character," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the space without any need for theatrical projection, "I think everyone should hear what you really think about me when you believe I'm not listening." I scrolled through my phone's audio files and selected the recording I'd made of my mother and Maria's kitchen conversation, the one where they'd outlined their Christmas manipulation strategy with clinical precision. The audio quality was crystal clear, and as their voices began playing through my phone's speaker, the lobby fell into absolute silence. "Once we trap her with all the kids on Christmas, she'll cave completely. She always does." Maria's voice emerged from the phone with devastating clarity, her words echoing off the lobby walls while the real Maria stood frozen in shock. "After this Christmas, she'll never say no to us again. We'll have broken down her last boundaries completely." The effect on my family was immediate and profound. My mother's face went white as she heard her own voice discussing the psychological conditioning they'd planned to inflict on me, while Maria began shaking her head frantically as if denying the evidence of her own recorded words. My father stepped backward, as if physically struck by the sound of their conversation, his earlier moral authority evaporating as the lobby full of witnesses heard him participating in what could only be described as a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation. "That's taken out of context." Maria stammered, her voice weak and unconvincing even to herself. "We weren't plotting anything malicious. We were just trying to coordinate family responsibilities in a way that would work for everyone." But I was already scrolling to the next recording, my father's financial confession that had revealed the scope of their systematic theft. His slurred voice filled the lobby as he detailed how they'd used my credit for unauthorized loans, extracted equity from my grandmother's house, and calculated the total value of resources they'd stolen at nearly $50,000 over 3 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Building residents who had been casually observing a family argument were now witnessing what amounted to a confession of financial fraud. And I could see several people pulling out their own phones to record what was clearly becoming an extraordinary public revelation of family dysfunction. My family members looked at each other with expressions of pure panic as they realized that their private manipulation strategies and financial crimes were being broadcast to a room full of strangers who lived in their community and would remember this moment for years to come. The public nature of the exposure was transforming their private shame into community knowledge that would follow them wherever they went. But the recordings were only the beginning of the evidence I'd prepared for this moment. From my purse, I pulled out a folder of organized financial documentation that I'd compiled during my weeks of investigation. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, mortgage documents revealing the theft of my inheritance, and credit reports demonstrating how my financial stability had been weaponized for their benefit. These documents show unauthorized transactions totaling $8,000 from my savings account over the past year alone. I announced, holding up bank statements with highlighted entries that made the theft undeniable. These mortgage papers prove that my parents secretly used my grandmother's house, which was left specifically to me as collateral for loans that funded Maria's house down payment and my parents' European vacation. I held up each document as I described its contents, giving the lobby full of witnesses time to see the official letterheads, the specific dollar amounts, and the dates that created an undeniable timeline of systematic financial exploitation. Maria was now crying, but not with the theatrical manipulation tears she'd deployed earlier. These were the helpless tears of someone whose carefully constructed lies were being demolished by irrefutable evidence. This credit report shows that I've been listed as a co-signer on loans I never agreed to, making me legally responsible for debts that fund other people's lifestyle choices. I continued, my voice remaining calm and factual, despite the magnitude of the revelations I was sharing. And this property tax statement shows that my parents owe $12,000 in back taxes on the house they've mortgaged using my inheritance, with foreclosure proceedings scheduled for March. The financial documents created a paper trail that no amount of emotional manipulation could contradict, and I watched my family members realize that their decades of gaslighting and psychological warfare had been rendered powerless by simple documentation and evidence. They had built their exploitation system on the assumption that I would never investigate or challenge their financial arrangements, and now their miscalculation was being exposed in the most public way possible. "This is your truth in your own words and your own signatures," I said, looking directly at each family member as I spoke. "And now everyone in our community will know exactly who you really are. Not the loving, sacrificing family members you pretend to be in public, but financial predators who systematically steal from the people who trust them most." The transformation in the lobby atmosphere was palpable. Building staff members who had initially viewed this as a private family dispute were now witnessing what appeared to be a criminal confession, while residents who lived in the same community as my parents were processing the realization that their neighbors were apparently capable of elaborate financial fraud against their own daughter. Emma, who had been standing apart from the adult group throughout their emotional performances, walked over to stand directly beside me in a gesture of support that spoke louder than any words could have. Her physical positioning made it clear to everyone present that the next generation was rejecting the toxic family patterns they'd inherited, choosing integrity over the comfortable lies that had enabled years of exploitation. I held their secrets, their shame, and their future reputations in my hands, and they finally understood the power had completely shifted. The complete exposure of their manipulation tactics and financial crimes had stripped away every facade they'd maintained for decades, leaving my family standing in my apartment lobby like actors whose scripts had been suddenly taken away mid-performance. The silence that followed my presentation of evidence was heavy with the weight of undeniable truth, but I could see in their faces that they were preparing one final desperate gambit to regain control of the situation they'd so catastrophically lost. My mother stepped forward, her earlier theatrical vulnerability replaced by a cold fury that I recognized from the worst moments of my childhood. When guilt and manipulation failed her, she had always resorted to ultimatums and threats of abandonment, wielding the fear of family rejection like a weapon designed to force compliance through terror of isolation. "Fine, Camilla. If this is how you want to play it, if you're going to expose us like this and humiliate your entire family in front of strangers, then you've made your choice," she said, her voice carrying the finality of someone delivering a death sentence. "You are completely dead to this family forever. Don't expect us to be there when you realize what a terrible mistake you've made, because after this betrayal, there will be no forgiveness and no way back." The threat that would have devastated me just months earlier now felt like a liberation I hadn't known I was waiting for. The prospect of permanent separation from people who had systematically exploited my resources and manipulated my emotions wasn't terrifying. It was remarkably appealing. But more than that, her ultimatum revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had driven our entire dysfunctional relationship for 27 years. "I've been dead to you my entire life," I replied, my voice steady and clear enough for every witness in the lobby to hear. "You just kept my bank account alive." The simplicity of that response seemed to hit her like a physical blow, and I watched her face cycle through expressions of shock, rage, and something that might have been recognition of the truth she'd been denying for decades. Around us, the lobby had become completely silent as residents and building staff absorbed the implications of what they were witnessing, not just a family argument, but the complete dismantling of a relationship built on financial exploitation disguised as love. My family members stared at me with expressions of genuine bewilderment, as if they were seeing me for the first time and couldn't reconcile this self-advocating woman with the compliant people-pleaser they'd spent years conditioning for maximum utility. The transformation wasn't just in my behavior, it was in my fundamental understanding of my own worth and my right to establish boundaries that protected my emotional and financial well-being. Maria opened and closed her mouth several times, apparently struggling to find words that could salvage their position now that their manipulation strategies had been exposed so completely. My father looked older than I'd ever seen him, the weight of his financial desperation and moral bankruptcy visible in his posture as he realized that his confession had provided me with legal evidence of fraud that could destroy whatever remained of their reputation. But it was Emma's reaction that tested my resolve most severely. She stepped away from my side and looked at me with tears streaming down her teenage face, her expression a mixture of admiration and heartbreak that reminded me painfully of how much collateral damage would result from this necessary boundary setting. "Camila, please," she said, her voice breaking with genuine emotion that cut through all the adult manipulation surrounding us. "I know they've done terrible things, and I know you have every right to be angry, but is there any way you can reconsider? I understand why you need to protect yourself, but losing you completely feels like losing the only adult in this family who ever treated me like a real person." Her plea was devastating in its authenticity, free of the calculated manipulation that had characterized every other family member's approach. Emma's tears were genuine. Her fear of losing our relationship was real, and her confusion about how to navigate the moral complexity of loving people who had behaved badly was heartbreakingly age-appropriate. I walked over to her and took her hands in mine, looking directly into her eyes as I spoke with the gentleness I would have wanted someone to show me at her age when I was struggling to understand why family relationships felt so painful and complicated. Emma, I need you to understand something that took me 27 years to learn. I said, my voice soft but firm. Truly healthy relationships never require one person's complete self-destruction to maintain. Love doesn't mean accepting abuse, and family doesn't mean allowing people to steal from you or manipulate your emotions for their benefit. I could see her processing my words, her intelligent eyes reflecting the internal struggle between her emotional attachment to family unity and her growing understanding of the toxic patterns she'd witnessed throughout her childhood. She was old enough to recognize the manipulation tactics her mother had taught her to use against me, but young enough to feel conflicted about rejecting the adults who had shaped her understanding of family relationships. What you saw today, the recordings, the financial documents, the evidence of systematic exploitation, that's not what healthy families do, I continued. Healthy families ask for help directly and honestly. They respect boundaries when people say no. They don't steal money or manipulate children into becoming weapons against the people they claim to love. Emma nodded slowly, her tears continuing to fall, but her expression showing signs of the moral clarity that would serve her well as she grew into adulthood. I understand, she whispered. I don't like it, but I understand why you can't keep letting them hurt you. The rest of my family had been listening to this conversation with growing agitation, apparently realizing that their last hope of emotional leverage was slipping away as Emma came to terms with the necessity of my boundaries. But their time for manipulation and control was over, and I felt ready to end this public confrontation with the dignity and finality it deserved. I walked toward the lobby exit, making it clear that this confrontation was concluded and that they needed to leave my building. My family followed reluctantly, their earlier theatrical confidence replaced by the defeated posture of people whose carefully constructed lies had been demolished in front of witnesses who would remember this day for years to come. At the building entrance, I turned to face them one final time, wanting my last words to reflect the emotional clarity and self-respect I'd finally learned to cultivate after decades of conditioning that had taught me to prioritize their needs over my own well-being. I hope someday you'll understand that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, not exploitation, I said. Until then, I wish you well, but I won't be participating in a family dynamic that requires my self-destruction to maintain. I closed the door on my painful past and opened it wide to a future where my needs and happiness actually mattered. The aftermath of severing ties with my family in such a public and definitive way left me feeling simultaneously liberated and overwhelmed, as if I'd been carrying a massive weight for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright without it. Back in the privacy of my apartment, surrounded by the familiar order and cleanliness that reflected my actual personality rather than the chaos I'd been conditioned to accept as normal, I began the systematic process of removing every avenue they could use to continue their manipulation campaign. The digital separation was more extensive than I'd anticipated, requiring me to methodically block dozens of phone numbers, social media accounts, and email addresses accumulated over years of extended family connections. Each contact I deleted felt like cutting another cord that had tethered me to their dysfunction, and I was surprised by the physical sensation of relief that accompanied each blocked number. My shoulders, which I hadn't realized were permanently tensed with anticipation of the next family crisis, or demand, began to relax for the first time in years. The most profound change was the silence. My phone, which had been a constant source of anxiety as I waited for the next guilt trip or financial request disguised as family emergency, now sat peacefully on my coffee table without the relentless buzzing that had characterized my life for so long. The absence of their voices in my daily routine created a space I hadn't known existed, a mental clarity that allowed me to think my own thoughts without the constant background noise of their emotional manipulation. To process the magnitude of what I'd experienced and done, I purchased a leather-bound journal specifically dedicated to working through the complex trauma patterns I was only beginning to understand. The therapeutic writing process revealed layers of conditioning I hadn't recognized as abnormal because they'd been my reality for so long. Page after page, I documented the systematic ways my emotional responses had been shaped to serve their needs rather than protect my own well-being. The journal entries became a form of archaeology, excavating memories and patterns that had been buried under decades of gaslighting and emotional manipulation. I wrote about the subtle ways they'd trained me to doubt my own perceptions, to prioritize their comfort over my basic needs, to interpret their exploitation as evidence of my importance to the family. Each revelation was simultaneously painful and liberating, showing me how thoroughly my sense of self had been constructed around their convenience, rather than my authentic identity. One of the most shocking discoveries in my therapeutic writing was recognizing how completely they'd isolated me from external support systems by positioning themselves as my primary source of social connection and emotional validation. They'd subtly discouraged friendships that might have provided alternative perspectives on their behavior, dismissed romantic relationships that might have competed with family obligations, and created a social ecosystem where I was dependent on their approval for my sense of worth and belonging. The employment situation that had felt so catastrophic during my Maldives escape required immediate attention, and consulting with a labor attorney revealed information that fundamentally changed my understanding of my legal position. The attorney explained that my employer's threats about termination for missing the Christmas Eve presentation were legally questionable, given that I'd been dealing with a legitimate family emergency, even if the emergency was escaping systematic exploitation rather than providing support during a medical crisis. More importantly, the attorney helped me understand that my excellent work history documented performance reviews, and the circumstances surrounding my absence created a strong foundation for negotiating my return to work on terms that protected my interests, rather than simply accepting whatever consequences my employer chose to impose. The consultation revealed that I had significantly more leverage in the situation than their intimidation tactics had led me to believe. The attorney also provided crucial guidance about the financial fraud I'd discovered, explaining the legal options available for recovering stolen funds and protecting my credit from further unauthorized use. Learning that my family's exploitation had violated multiple federal and state laws gave me a sense of validation I hadn't expected. Their behavior wasn't just emotionally damaging, it was criminally actionable, which meant my reactions to their treatment weren't oversensitive, but entirely appropriate responses to actual crimes. Perhaps the most healing discovery in this process was researching support groups for adults who had experienced financial and emotional manipulation by family members. The internet revealed communities of thousands of people sharing remarkably similar stories of systematic exploitation disguised as family love, and reading their experiences helped me understand that the dynamics I'd endured weren't unique or evidence of some personal failing on my part. The support group research introduced me to terminology I'd never encountered, but which perfectly described my experiences. Financial abuse, emotional manipulation, parentification, and trauma bonding were all concepts that provided framework for understanding the systematic nature of what I'd endured. Learning that these patterns had names, that they were recognized forms of psychological abuse, and that recovery was possible, gave me hope that the healing process I was beginning would lead to genuine freedom rather than just temporary relief. Online forums connected me with people at various stages of recovery from similar family dynamics, and their stories provided both validation and practical guidance for navigating the complex emotions that accompanied breaking free from exploitative relationships. Many described the same mixture of guilt and relief I was experiencing, the same confusion about whether they were justified in setting boundaries against people who claimed to love them. My freedom would require fighting several battles ahead, but for the first time in my life, I was fighting for my own happiness and well-being. The battles I was fighting for my own well-being began yielding unexpected allies, as word of my family's public exposure spread through our extended social network with the rapid efficiency that only genuine scandal can achieve. Within days of the apartment lobby confrontation, my phone began receiving calls and messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, people who had apparently been waiting for someone to break the silence about patterns they'd observed but felt unable to address directly. My cousin Jennifer, who lived in California and only saw the family during major holidays, was the first to reach out with information that recontextualized years of family gatherings I'd participated in without understanding the broader dynamics at play. Camila, I heard about what happened with your parents and Maria, and I need you to know that several of us have been talking about their behavior for years, she said during a phone call that lasted nearly 2 hours. What you exposed isn't news to those of us who've been watching from a distance. It's validation of concerns we've had, but didn't know how to address. Jennifer's revelations were followed by similar calls from other extended family members, who began sharing their own experiences of manipulation and financial pressure from the same family members who had systematically exploited me. Uncle Roberto confessed that my father had borrowed money from him 3 years ago, using fabricated stories about business opportunities that were actually attempts to cover personal debt. Cousin Sarah revealed that Maria had pressured her into providing free graphic design services for a business venture that never materialized, using family loyalty as leverage to extract professional labor without compensation. The pattern that emerged from these conversations was both validating and horrifying. I wasn't their only victim, just their most successfully conditioned one. They had been running smaller-scale manipulation campaigns on multiple family members, testing strategies and refining techniques that they then deployed against me with devastating effectiveness because of my proximity and financial stability. Aunt Linda's response to learning about the full scope of their manipulation was swift and decisive in a way that surprised everyone who knew her typically diplomatic approach to family conflicts. She organized what she called a family accountability initiative, reaching out to every relative who had been invited to their gatherings over the past several years to inform them about the financial fraud and systematic exploitation that had been funding their elaborate celebrations. Her investigation revealed that Maria's manipulation extended far beyond her immediate family, creating a network of female relatives who had been systematically exploited for various forms of unpaid labor and financial support. Linda documented how Maria had convinced different cousins to provide childcare event planning, financial assistance, and professional services by using the same guilt-based manipulation tactics she'd perfected on me, rotating through family members to avoid creating too much resentment in any single relationship. The family-wide boycott Linda organized wasn't just symbolic. It was designed to eliminate Maria's access to the unpaid labor and financial contributions that had subsidized her lifestyle for years. When Maria's birthday party was scheduled for February, only 3 people attended despite her usual guest list of 25 family members. Her children's school events suddenly lacked the volunteer helpers she'd always relied on, and the elaborate holiday celebrations she'd built her social reputation around became logistical impossibilities without the network of exploited relatives who had previously made them possible. During this period of family reckoning, I channeled my therapeutic writing into a more public form of advocacy by composing an anonymous blog post about recognizing financial abuse within family relationships. The piece, which I titled "When Family Love Comes with Hidden Price Tags," described the subtle ways financial manipulation could be disguised as family loyalty, using my own experiences as examples without identifying specific individuals or locations. The blog post was initially intended for a small online community focused on financial independence and boundary setting, but it was shared across social media platforms with an intensity that shocked me. Within a week, it had been read by over 50,000 people, generating hundreds of comments from women sharing remarkably similar stories of family members who had systematically exploited their financial stability, emotional labor, or professional skills under the guise of family obligations. The comments section became a support community of women documenting experiences that were variations on the same theme. Parents who used their daughter's credit without permission, siblings who treated sisters as free childcare services, and extended family members who positioned guilt and obligation as evidence of love while systematically extracting resources and labor. Many commenters expressed gratitude for finally having language to describe dynamics they'd experienced but hadn't recognized as abusive. The viral nature of the blog post created ripple effects in my local community as people began connecting the anonymous story with the public confrontation that had occurred in my apartment building. Neighbors who had witnessed the lobby drama began sharing the blog post on community forums, and local discussion groups started openly addressing the patterns of family dysfunction that many residents had observed but previously considered too private to discuss. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor who had documented my exploitation patterns, became something of a community advocate for recognizing and addressing family financial abuse. She organized informal gatherings where women could share their experiences and support each other in establishing healthier boundaries with manipulative relatives. Her documentation of my situation became a template for other women to recognize when family assistance requests had crossed the line into systematic exploitation. The community response validated my decision to expose their behavior in the most public way possible. People who had previously viewed my family as pillars of their social circle began questioning the source of their apparent prosperity and the sustainability of their elaborate lifestyle. The whispered conversations at grocery stores and community events gradually shifted from speculation about my disappearance to open discussion about the financial crimes and manipulation tactics that had been revealed. Local business owners who had provided services for my family's events began sharing stories about unpaid bills and last-minute cancellations that now made sense in the context of their exposed financial instability. The reputation they had carefully cultivated as successful, generous community members crumbled as people realized that their apparent prosperity had been built on systematic theft from their own daughter. Their carefully constructed reputation crumbled publicly, while mine grew stronger with every woman who bravely shared her own survival story. The public vindication I was experiencing created a foundation of external support that allowed me to explore what my life could look like when it was actually mine to design, rather than constantly shaped by family manipulation and emergency demands. For the first time in my adult life, I faced a weekend with no family obligations, no guilt-inducing phone calls, and no urgent requests that would transform my personal time into unpaid labor for people who took my availability for granted. That first Saturday of complete autonomy felt almost surreal in its simplicity. I woke up naturally without alarms, made coffee in my quiet kitchen while reading the news on my tablet, and then drove to a forest preserve I'd been wanting to explore for months, but had never had time to visit because weekends were always consumed by family demands. The hiking trail wound through woods that were stark and beautiful in their winter dormancy, and I found myself genuinely present in the moment, rather than mentally calculating how much time I could spend outdoors before needing to prepare for the next family obligation. The silence of the forest felt profound after years of constant background anxiety about phone calls and text messages that would require immediate response and emotional labor. I walked for 3 hours without checking my phone once, absorbing the peace of being completely unreachable by people who had trained me to prioritize their crises over my own well-being. The physical act of walking alone through nature became a meditation on autonomy, each step reinforcing my right to exist as an individual rather than an extension of family needs. Sunday brought similar revelations about the possibilities of unstructured personal time. I spent the morning reading a novel I'd purchased months earlier but never had opportunity to finish luxuriating in the experience of following someone else's story without interruption. The afternoon included a casual coffee date with someone I'd met through a dating app. Not because I was desperately seeking romance, but because I was curious about connecting with another person without the constant undertone of family drama that had made previous relationships feel impossible to sustain. The coffee date conversation flowed naturally without the anxious edge that had characterized my interactions with potential romantic partners when I was constantly braced for family emergencies that would require me to cancel plans or leave early. For the first time, I was able to be fully present with another person rather than mentally calculating whether my family would approve of how I was spending my time or whether I should be doing something more productive for their benefit. It was at my neighborhood coffee shop the following Tuesday that I met Sarah, a woman about my age who was working on her laptop at a corner table when I stopped in for my morning caffeine routine. Something about her demeanor caught my attention. She had the same slightly hyper-vigilant quality I recognized in myself, the way people look when they're accustomed to managing other people's emotions and anticipating crisis calls that could derail their day at any moment. Our initial conversation began casually, typical stranger small talk about coffee preferences and work deadlines, but evolved into something much deeper when she mentioned feeling guilty about enjoying her peaceful Tuesday morning because she wasn't helping her sister with childcare. The specific language she used, "I know I should be more available to help family," triggered immediate recognition of the manipulation patterns I'd been deconstructing in my own life. What followed was a 3-hour conversation that felt like looking into a mirror of experiences I'd thought were unique to my family. Sarah described financial requests that were framed as temporary emergencies but never repaid emotional manipulation disguised as family loyalty, and the systematic erosion of her boundaries through guilt campaigns that positioned self-care as selfishness. Her story differed in details but was identical in structure to my own exploitation experience. The instant connection we formed went beyond sympathy or shared complaint. It was the profound relief of being understood by someone who had navigated the same psychological minefield. Sarah had also been the family member with stable employment and good credit, which made her the default solution for everyone else's financial problems. She had also struggled with guilt about setting boundaries, because saying no to family felt like evidence of moral deficiency, rather than healthy self-protection. Our friendship developed rapidly because we could skip the exhausting process of explaining why family manipulation was harmful to people who had never experienced systematic exploitation disguised as love. We understood each other's hypervigilance around family contact, the complex emotions involved in protecting ourselves from people we'd been conditioned to prioritize, and the ongoing work required to develop authentic relationships after years of training that confused manipulation with affection. Through conversations with Sarah and the women who contacted me about the viral blog post, I discovered that helping others recognize and escape family financial abuse energized me in ways that my corporate data analysis work never had. There was something deeply satisfying about providing validation and practical guidance to people who were experiencing the same confusion and isolation I'd endured during my years of exploitation. The confidence I gained from establishing boundaries with my family created unexpected positive effects in my professional life that I hadn't anticipated. My willingness to advocate for my own interests, learned through necessity in dealing with family manipulation, translated directly into more effective workplace negotiations and project management. The employment attorney consultation had empowered me to return to work with clear expectations about my value and rights, rather than accepting whatever treatment my employer chose to impose. My performance review in February resulted in the promotion I'd been working toward for 2 years, along with a salary increase that reflected my contributions more accurately than previous compensation packages. My supervisor specifically noted that my increased confidence and boundary-setting skills had improved my leadership effectiveness and made me more successful in client negotiations. The same assertiveness that my family had punished as selfishness was valued and rewarded in professional contexts, where clear communication and self-advocacy were recognized as strengths. The irony wasn't lost on me that learning to protect myself from family exploitation had made me more successful in every other area of my life. The emotional energy I'd been expending on managing other people's crises and maintaining relationships through self-sacrifice was now available for career advancement, personal growth, and building genuine connections with people who respected my boundaries, rather than testing them constantly. I wasn't just building a completely new life. I was finally discovering the strong, confident woman I was always meant to become. The strong, confident woman I was becoming felt ready to celebrate publicly what I'd accomplished privately, and the perfect opportunity presented itself when I realized I'd never properly shared the triumphant photos from my Maldives escape that had started this entire transformation. The images I'd carefully curated during those 5 days in paradise had been sitting in my phone's camera roll like trophies, waiting for the right moment to be displayed. And now that my new life was taking solid shape, I felt ready to let the world see exactly how spectacular my rebellion had been. I selected the most beautiful photo from my collection, myself on the overwater villa deck at sunset champagne glass, raised toward a sky painted in impossible shades of orange and pink, my face showing genuine joy rather than the forced smiles I'd worn for family gatherings for decades. The image captured everything about the freedom I'd discovered and the authentic happiness that came from choosing myself over family manipulation. The caption I wrote was deliberately pointed but celebratory. Best Christmas ever. No family obligations. No guilt trips, just pure freedom and self-care. Sometimes you have to travel 8,000 miles to find yourself. But the journey is worth every penny you spend on your own happiness instead of funding other people's manipulation schemes. The response to the post was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, hundreds of likes and comments appeared from friends, colleagues, acquaintances, and complete strangers who had apparently been following my story through various social media connections. Many comments came from women expressing admiration for my courage in choosing self-care over family expectations, while others shared abbreviated versions of their own experiences with family manipulation and financial exploitation. But it was the second photo I posted that created the viral moment I hadn't anticipated. I shared an image of my first-class boarding pass to the Maldives with the caption, "No kids to babysit, no drama to manage, no manipulation to endure. Just authentic happiness purchased with money that was actually mine to spend." The boarding pass photo included visible details about the date, destination, and expense that made the extent of my rebellion undeniable. The post exploded across social media platforms with a velocity that shocked me. It was shared thousands of times within the first day with women around the world, using it as a symbol of choosing self-respect over family obligation. The hashtag #MaldivesChristmas began trending as women posted their own photos of vacations, spa days, and solo adventures they'd chosen, instead of subjecting themselves to family manipulation during holidays. The viral nature of my celebration created consequences I hadn't fully considered, but found deeply satisfying. Through mutual friends and social media connections, my family members inevitably saw the posts and realized that their entire social circle now had visual evidence of my successful escape from their manipulation. The photos made it clear that while they were dealing with pizza delivery, Christmas disasters, and community shame, I had been living in luxury funded by money they'd tried to steal. My mother's response came through a mutual friend who reported that she was humiliated beyond words, that I was flaunting my selfishness so publicly and making it obvious to everyone that I'd chosen personal pleasure over family responsibility. Maria apparently went through her own social media accounts, deleting photos and references to family gatherings where I'd provided unpaid labor, as if removing evidence could undo the years of exploitation that everyone now understood. The viral moment generated private messages that were more meaningful than the public celebration. My inbox filled with hundreds of detailed messages from women sharing their own stories of family financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and the complex guilt that accompanied setting boundaries against people who claimed to love them. Many described feeling isolated and crazy for recognizing manipulation patterns that other family members dismissed as normal family dynamics. A message from a woman named Patricia in Ohio particularly moved me. "Your boarding pass photo gave me the courage to say no to my sister's demand that I fund her daughter's wedding because I don't have kids of my own to spend money on. I've been the family ATM for 15 years, and seeing your successful escape made me realize I could choose myself too." Another woman, Jessica from Seattle, wrote, "I showed your Maldives photos to my therapist as an example of what healthy boundary setting looks like. My parents have been using my credit cards for their expenses for 3 years, and I've been too guilty to stop them. Your story helped me understand that protecting my financial future isn't selfish, it's survival." The international response was equally powerful. Women from Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and countries across Europe shared remarkably similar stories of family members who had systematically exploited their financial stability, emotional labor, or professional skills while positioning the exploitation as evidence of family love and loyalty. Many messages included specific details about manipulation tactics that were identical to my own experiences, parents who used daughters' credit without permission, siblings who treated sisters as free childcare services, and extended family members who positioned guilt and obligation as evidence of love, while systematically extracting resources. The universality of these patterns was both validating and heartbreaking, revealing how common family financial abuse was despite being rarely discussed openly. The viral celebration also attracted attention from domestic violence organizations and financial abuse prevention groups who reached out to share resources and invite me to speak at conferences about recognizing family manipulation. Several nonprofit organizations requested permission to use my story as educational material to help other women identify when family assistance requests had crossed the line into systematic exploitation. A particularly meaningful connection came from Dr. Rachel Thompson, a psychologist specializing in family trauma, who explained that my public documentation of systematic manipulation provided valuable insight into how financial abuse operated within family systems. She described my experience as a textbook example of how emotional manipulation could be used to maintain access to financial resources while preventing victims from recognizing or reporting the abuse. The viral moment created ripple effects in my local community as people connected the social media celebration with the apartment lobby confrontation that many had witnessed or heard about through neighborhood networks. Local women began reaching out to share their own experiences with family manipulation, and several informal support groups formed around helping each other establish healthy boundaries with exploitative relatives. Mrs. Henderson reported that multiple neighbors had approached her asking for advice about recognizing financial abuse within their own families. The community conversations that began with my public confrontation had evolved into broader discussions about protecting vulnerable family members from systematic exploitation, while supporting those who chose to break free from toxic family dynamics. My authentic truth became a powerful beacon of hope for countless others still trapped in the same psychological web I had finally escaped. The beacon of hope I had become for women trapped in family exploitation carried responsibilities I embraced with the same determination I'd used to escape my own toxic situation. The viral celebration of my freedom had created a community of survivors who looked to my story as proof that liberation was possible, but it also attracted one final desperate attempt from my family to reassert control over the narrative they were losing. The reconciliation effort came through Emma, who called me 6 months after our apartment lobby confrontation with a message she'd clearly been coached to deliver. "Camila, everyone misses you so much, and the family has been talking about how we can all move forward together," she said, her teenage voice carrying undertones of adult manipulation that broke my heart. "Mom and Grandma want you to know that family comes first, and they're willing to forgive everything if you're ready to come home and be part of the family again." The phrase, "family comes first," was their most reliable manipulation tool, designed to trigger decades of conditioning that had taught me to prioritize their needs over my own well-being. But instead of the familiar rush of guilt and obligation, I felt only clarity about the response that would honor both my growth and Emma's need to witness healthy boundary setting. "Emma, please tell them that I am my own family now, and I treat myself with the respect I deserve," I said, my voice calm and confident in a way that would have been impossible before my transformation. Real families don't require one person's financial destruction or emotional sacrifice to function. When they're ready to build relationships based on mutual respect, rather than exploitation, they know how to reach me. The finality of that response marked the end of their attempts to reclaim control over my life, freeing me to focus entirely on the mission that had emerged from my personal liberation. Using the technical skills that had made me valuable in the corporate world, I designed and launched an online platform specifically for adults escaping family financial abuse, creating resources that combined practical guidance with emotional support for people navigating the complex trauma of protecting themselves from manipulative relatives. The website, which I called Financial Boundaries, included tools for documenting exploitation patterns, template letters for establishing no-contact boundaries, legal resources for reporting financial fraud, and forums where survivors could connect with others who understood the unique challenges of family-based abuse. I incorporated everything I'd learned about manipulation tactics, gaslighting techniques, and the psychological conditioning that kept victims trapped in exploitative relationships. The response to the platform exceeded every expectation I'd had about its potential impact. Within the first month, over 3,000 women had registered for accounts, sharing stories that revealed the widespread nature of family financial abuse and the desperate need for resources specifically designed to address this form of exploitation. The forums became spaces where women could validate each other's experiences and provide practical guidance for establishing financial independence from manipulative family members. One of the most significant discoveries that emerged from the platform was learning that 3 additional female relatives in my own extended family had been long-term victims of similar exploitation patterns. My cousin Maria Elena reached out through the website's anonymous messaging system to share her own story of systematic financial manipulation by the same family members who had targeted me, revealing that our experiences were part of a multi-generational pattern of abuse against women with financial stability. Through her testimony and that of 2 other female cousins, I learned that my grandmother's generation had also included women who were systematically exploited for their resources by male family members who positioned financial extraction as evidence of family loyalty. The pattern had been passed down through generations, with each cohort of women learning to accept exploitation as proof of their value to the family structure. This revelation cemented my understanding that my escape and advocacy work weren't just personal healing activities. They were disruptions to intergenerational cycles of abuse that would continue unless someone broke the pattern definitively. The women contacting me through the platform represented not just individual survivors, but the first generation willing to publicly name and reject family manipulation tactics that had been normalized for decades. The success of the platform led to speaking engagements at domestic violence conferences, interviews with financial abuse prevention organizations, and collaboration with attorneys specializing in family financial fraud. My story became a case study in how systematic exploitation could be disguised as family obligation, and how victims could reclaim their lives through strategic boundary setting and legal action. A year after my Maldives escape, I sat in my beautifully redecorated apartment, walls painted in colors I'd chosen because they made me happy, rather than because they were practical or family-approved, planning my next solo international adventure while monitoring the Financial Boundaries platform for new members who needed support and guidance. The space reflected my authentic preferences for the first time in my adult life, decorated with art I'd purchased, because it brought me joy, rather than because it fit some external standard of appropriateness. My savings account, no longer subject to unauthorized withdrawals, had grown to levels that would fund not just personal adventures, but also expansion of the support platform to reach women internationally. The financial security I'd built through years of responsible planning was finally serving my own dreams, rather than subsidizing other people's manipulation schemes. The evening ritual I'd established involved responding to messages from platform members who were in various stages of recognizing and escaping family exploitation. Each conversation reminded me that the courage I'd summoned to board that plane to the Maldives had created ripple effects that were helping women across the world choose themselves over toxic family dynamics. As I planned my upcoming trip to New Zealand, another solo adventure funded entirely by money that belonged to me, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed from the woman who had once believed that love required self-destruction. The revolution I'd started by refusing to babysit 9 children on Christmas had evolved into a movement of women reclaiming their voices, their resources, and their right to establish boundaries against anyone who tried to exploit them. This Christmas, I didn't just save myself from a lifetime of exploitation. I started a revolution of women who absolutely refused to be used by anyone, including their own families. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. Millions of women around the world are trapped in similar cycles of family financial abuse and emotional manipulation, believing that love requires self-destruction and that boundaries are selfish. But as Camila's journey proves, choosing yourself isn't betrayal. It's survival. The signs of family financial exploitation are often subtle but devastating. Unauthorized access to your accounts, guilt trips about spending money on yourself, manipulation disguised as family emergencies, and the expectation that your resources belong to everyone except you. These aren't normal family dynamics. They're systematic abuse patterns that destroy lives while masquerading as love. If you recognize yourself in Camila's story, know that escape is possible. Document everything, seek legal advice, build your support network, and remember that healthy relationships never require your financial or emotional destruction. You have the right to protect your resources, establish boundaries, and choose your own well-being over family manipulation. Please subscribe to this channel if Camila's story inspired you to examine your own family relationships and consider whether the people who claim to love you are actually respecting your autonomy and financial security. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on stories that empower women to recognize manipulation and choose themselves over toxic family dynamics. In the comments below, share your thoughts about family financial boundaries. Have you experienced similar manipulation? What signs helped you recognize exploitation? Your story might be the validation another woman needs to start her own journey toward freedom. Remember to protect your privacy by not sharing identifying details, but your experiences can provide hope and guidance to others who are struggling with the same toxic patterns. This story isn't just entertainment, it's a roadmap for revolution. Every woman who chooses self-respect over family exploitation weakens the system that keeps us trapped. Every boundary we establish teaches the next generation that love doesn't require self-destruction. Every time we say no to manipulation, we make it easier for other women to find their voices and reclaim their lives. Subscribe, comment, and share this story with any woman who needs to hear that her happiness matters. Her financial security is worth protecting and her voice deserves to be heard. Together, we can create a world where family love is based on mutual respect rather than systematic exploitation.